before the first sword was drawn, before the siege towers creaked against Trojan walls, and long before the name of Achilles burned its way into legend, the war that would come to be known as the Trojan War was born not from ambition or strategy, but from a quarrel among gods. It was not forged in the minds of kings, nor in the hearts of warriors, but at a wedding, an immortal celebration marred by a single act of vengeance and vanity. This, the origin of one of the greatest epics in human history, began not on a battlefield, but in the heavens. The gods of Olympus had gathered to celebrate the union of Peleus and Thetis, a mortal king and a sea goddess, whose son, it was said, would be mightier than his father. It was a rare moment when divine and mortal realms converged, a moment that promised peace, blessing, and honor. All of Olympus had been invited, save one. Eris, the goddess of discord, had been left uninvited, her presence deemed too volatile, too dangerous for harmony. But Eris did not forget. She did not forgive. Into the golden halls where gods feasted and mortals bowed, she cast a single object, a golden apple. Inscribed upon its polished surface were 3 words: "To the fairest." What followed was not simply a squabble, it was the unraveling of Olympus's delicate balance. Hera, queen of the gods, Athena, goddess of wisdom and war, and Aphrodite, goddess of love and desire, all laid claim to the apple. None would yield, and so they turned to Zeus, the king of the gods, to decide. But Zeus, in his wisdom or cowardice, refused to judge. Instead, he appointed a mortal to bear the burden of choice. Far from Olympus, in the green pastures of Mount Ida near Troy, a young man named Paris lived in exile. Unknown to him, his fate, and the fate of empires, hung in the balance. Paris was no ordinary shepherd. He was the son of Priam, king of Troy, and had been cast away at birth due to a prophecy that he would bring about the destruction of his city. Raised in obscurity, Paris had grown to be handsome, thoughtful, and favored by the gods, though he did not yet know it. When Hermes descended from Olympus and led the 3 goddesses before him, Paris found himself faced with an impossible choice. Each goddess offered him a gift in exchange for the golden apple. Hera promised power, dominion over all of Asia. Athena offered wisdom and military glory, victory in all battles. But Aphrodite promised him the love of the most beautiful woman in the world. Paris, driven not by ambition or strategy, but by the ache of desire, chose Aphrodite. He handed her the apple and sealed his fate, and that of countless others. The most beautiful woman in the world was Helen, wife of Menelaus, king of Sparta. She was the daughter of Zeus and Leda, and her beauty was said to rival that of the goddesses themselves. Her marriage had been hard-won. When she came of age, every noble and hero in Greece had sought her hand. Fearing the bloodshed that might follow her choice, her mortal guardian, Tyndareus, devised a pact. All suitors would swear an oath to protect Helen and her chosen husband, whomever he might be. When she chose Menelaus, that oath bound the greatest, warriors of Greece to his cause. Paris traveled to Sparta under the protection of Aphrodite, and there he was welcomed as a guest. Menelaus, bound by the sacred rules of hospitality, offered him honor and shelter. But when the king left for Crete, Paris betrayed his host. He seduced Helen, or perhaps she went willingly, lured by Aphrodite's enchantment, and fled with her to Troy. The bond of marriage had been broken, the sacred trust of hospitality violated. An oath forged years earlier now demanded action. Menelaus returned to find his wife gone and his pride wounded. He turned to his brother Agamemnon, king of Mycenae, the most powerful monarch in Greece. Together, they invoked the oath of Helen's suitors. Across the land, messengers were sent. The call to arms echoed through every kingdom, summoning heroes and kings to join the war effort. This was not merely a husband's grievance, it became a cause of honor, vengeance, and prestige. Among those summoned was Odysseus, king of Ithaca. Known for his cunning, Odysseus had no desire to fight in a war over another man's wife. newly married to Penelope and father to a newborn son, he feigned madness to avoid the summons, yoking an ox and a donkey together and plowing his fields with salt. But Palamedes, sent to retrieve him, exposed the ruse by placing Odysseus's infant in the furrow. Odysseus swerved, and the truth was revealed. Bound by honor, he joined the host. Farther north, in Phthia, lived Achilles, the son of Peleus and Thetis, and the greatest warrior of his age. But Achilles' fate was shadowed by prophecy. Thetis, fearing her son's death, hid him away on the island of Skyros, disguised as a girl among the daughters of King Lycomedes. There, Achilles lived in secrecy, until Odysseus, now forced to serve, devised a plan to reveal him. Disguised as a merchant, Odysseus offered jewels and weapons to the maidens. While the others chose finery, one reached for a sword. The ruse fell, and Achilles, revealed, was persuaded to join the campaign, promised eternal glory in exchange for a short life. The Greek forces gathered at Aulis, their ships massed like a forest upon the sea, but the winds would not come. The fleet stood stranded, paralyzed by divine will. A seer, Calchas, was consulted, and the truth emerged. Artemis had been offended. To appease the goddess, Agamemnon must sacrifice his daughter, Iphigenia. Torn between his ambition and his love for his child, Agamemnon chose the war. Iphigenia was summoned under false pretenses, told she would marry Achilles. But at the altar she was offered to the gods. Whether she died or was spared by divine intervention remains debated in myth, but the winds came and the fleet set sail. Across the wine-dark sea, the ship sailed to Troy, a walled city of unmatched splendor. There, Priam ruled with wisdom, supported by his sons. Hector, noble and brave, Paris, charming and fated, and a host of princes, allies, and warriors. The Trojans were not villains, nor were they weak. They were proud, cultured, and prepared. When Helen arrived, she was both honored and blamed, welcomed as a queen, and feared as a harbinger of doom. Thus began the siege. 10 years would pass before the walls of Troy would fall. For a decade, gods and men would clash, kings would die, heroes would rise and fall, and the question of fate and choice would echo louder than any war cry. The spark that began with a golden apple now roared into a flame that would consume thousands. The war was no longer about Helen. It became a proving ground for glory, a test of loyalty, and a canvas for divine agendas painted in mortal blood. But in the beginning, before the bloodshed, before the wooden horse, before Achilles' rage and Hector's fall, there was a choice. One man, one apple, one promise. Paris chose beauty. And in that moment, the world changed forever. The ships landed not as a silent fleet, but as a storm. The Achaean host, Greeks as they would later be called, numbered in the thousands, drawn from every kingdom, isle, and citadel of the known world. They came with swords and spears, with chariots and shields, with gods in their hearts and vengeance in their mouths. At their head, Agamemnon, king of kings, bore the weight of command and pride. Around him stood the greatest warriors of their age: Achilles, swift-footed and fierce; Odysseus, wise and wily; Ajax the Greater, a tower of might; Diomedes, lion-hearted; Nestor, old and wise; and many more, each with their own legacy, each drawn into a war not entirely their own. When they reached the shores near Troy, the war did not begin with a single strike. There was no immediate clash of titans, no fall of walls. The war unfolded as a siege, a long and grueling campaign marked by raids, duels, and skirmishes that carved slow scars into the earth and the hearts of men. For 9 years, the Greeks laid waste to the surrounding lands, sacking allied cities, disrupting supply lines, and trying to isolate Troy. It was not brute strength that would break the city. It was attrition. Troy stood resilient. Its walls, said to be built by gods, loomed over the plain, impenetrable. Hector, son of Priam and prince of Troy, led the defense with honor. A warrior unmatched among his people, Hector fought not for conquest, but for protection of his city, his family, his legacy. He was no mirror of Achilles. Where Achilles burned with glory and wrath, Hector stood for duty and order. And, as the siege dragged on, it became clear this would not be a swift victory. Meanwhile, the gods watched, intervened, and played their own game of allegiances. The war among mortals was mirrored by the quarrels of Olympus. Hera and Athena, spurned by Paris in his judgment of the apple, sided with the Greeks, working behind the scenes to bring Troy to ruin. Aphrodite, protector of Paris and the force behind Helen's love, favored the Trojans. Apollo, too, lent his strength to the sons of Priam. Zeus, though king of the gods, remained outwardly neutral, but even his will was not free of the threads of fate. The Greeks fought many battles in the fields before Troy. Raids were constant, seeking to demoralize the enemy and enrich the soldiers. In one such raid, Achilles captured many Trojan allies and slaves, including Briseis, a woman of great beauty and dignity. She became a symbol, not just of Achilles' might, but of what he could lose. This loss would soon prove catastrophic. Among the notable achievements during these early years was the rise of Diomedes, a warrior whose valor in battle was favored even by the gods. In one of the war's most fabled moments, Diomedes wounded Ares, god of war, and Aphrodite herself. Emboldened by Athena, he stormed the battlefield with a fury unmatched, slaying countless enemies and nearly reaching the very gates of Troy. Yet the city held, and time moved forward. Odysseus, ever the tactician, contributed more through cunning than brute strength. He helped win allies to the Greek cause, including the reluctant Neoptolemus, Achilles' son, prophesied to be crucial to the war's outcome, and convinced the bow of Heracles, held by the bitter and exiled Philoctetes, to be brought to Troy. But these events, important though they were, belonged to the later years. The first phase of the war was marked not by great sieges, but by small victories, fleeting raids, and mounting fatigue. The Achaeans suffered under the weight of distance, illness, and infighting. Food became scarce, morale waned, and then came the quarrel, the moment that changed everything. Chryseis, daughter of a Trojan priest of Apollo, had been taken as a war prize by Agamemnon. Her father pleaded for her return, offering ransom and prayer. Agamemnon refused, and Apollo's wrath descended. A plague swept through the Greek camp, killing men by the hundreds. Finally, pressed by his own suffering people and the prophecies of Calchas, Agamemnon relented, but not without spite. He returned Chryseis, but in compensation, he took Briseis from Achilles. The insult was unbearable. Achilles, the greatest of the Greeks, whose spear none could rival, whose presence inspired terror in Trojans and pride among Achaeans, withdrew from the war. He cursed Agamemnon, swearing not to raise his blade for the Greeks again. And as he retreated to his tent, the tide of war began to turn. With Achilles gone, the Trojans surged. Led by Hector, they broke out from their gates and pushed the Greeks back to their ships. The battlefield that had once been Greek territory was now a contested plain. Menelaus, seeking to end the war, challenged Paris to single combat. The two met, sword to sword, but Paris, outmatched, was saved by Aphrodite, spirited away before the final blow. The duel resolved nothing. The bloodshed resumed. As the Trojans pressed their advantage, the Greeks began to despair. Ajax, Diomedes, and Odysseus fought valiantly, but the absence of Achilles was a wound in their ranks. Without him, their strength was halved. Hector, emboldened, slew countless men and drove the enemy to the brink. In a desperate attempt to defend the ships, Ajax fought with towering might, holding off waves of Trojan assault. But the climax of the early war came not from generals, but from grief. Patroclus, closest companion to Achilles, whether friend or something more, could no longer watch the slaughter. He donned Achilles' armor, hoping to inspire the Greeks and frighten the Trojans. It worked. The tide turned. For a moment, hope returned. Patroclus drove the Trojans back, even slaying Sarpedon, son of Zeus. But pride undid him. Pushing too far, he was struck down by Hector. The death of Patroclus shattered Achilles. Rage unlike any before consumed him, not the rage of insult, but of loss, of grief, of helplessness. He returned to the field not for honor or duty, but for vengeance. What followed would become legend. Achilles, clad in new armor forged by Hephaestus, himself descended upon the Trojans like a god of death. No man could stand before him. The Scamander River ran red with the blood he spilled. He met Hector outside the walls, and the two fought, equals in skill, if not in fate. Hector fell, pierced by Achilles' spear, and with his dying breath, asked for his body to be returned to his family. Achilles refused. He tied Hector's corpse to his chariot and dragged it before the walls of Troy, a final insult that pierced the hearts of all who watched. And yet in this darkness, a moment of grace. Priam, king of Troy, father of Hector, entered the Greek camp alone, guided by Hermes. He knelt before Achilles, kissed his hands, the same hands that had killed his son, and begged for Hector's body. Achilles, moved by the sight, by the courage, by the shared pain of fatherhood, wept. He returned the body. For a moment, humanity returned. But the war was not over. It would rage on, fueled by new prophecies, new arrivals, new strategies. Achilles himself would fall, struck by Paris with an arrow guided by Apollo. His heel, the only vulnerable part of his divine forged body. Ajax and Odysseus would quarrel over Achilles' armor, and Ajax, denied the prize, would fall into madness and take his own life. Troy's allies would dwindle, Greek numbers would strain, and then Odysseus would conceive a final plan, a wooden horse, a gift, a trick, a symbol of everything the war had become. But that is another chapter. This, the first years of the war, was not just about battles, it was about choices of men and gods. It was about pride and the cost of pride, about friendship and loss, about heroes born and heroes broken. Before the walls of Troy, amid the dust and fire, the greatest generation of warriors carved their names into history, not in triumph, but in pain, blood, and memory. Let us now return to the battlefield, not at its height, but as its glory begins, to turn gray with the dust of decline. The Trojan War had raged for nearly 10 years, and in that long span, heroes had risen, fallen, and risen again. But glory is never eternal. The age of heroes was beginning to fracture. Each death, each dishonored vow, each twist of divine intervention brought the war closer to its bitter climax. The gods watched. Men bled. And the tide, slowly, inexorably, began to shift. Achilles was dead. That flame, that force of chaos and clarity had been extinguished. Paris, guided by Apollo, had loosed the fatal arrow that struck the only vulnerable place on the invincible man, his heel. The death of Achilles sent a shiver through both armies. The Greeks mourned their greatest warrior. The Trojans rejoiced, but not without unease, for the wrath of Achilles had been terrible, and they knew that such a death would not go unanswered. Now, the armor of Achilles, a gift of the gods, forged by Hephaestus, became the prize for which mortal pride would clash once more. Ajax the Greater, towering and valiant, claimed it as his by right of strength and loyalty, but Odysseus, ever the tactician, argued that he, through his wit and service, had earned it more. The Greeks, valuing words as much as wounds, awarded it to Odysseus. Ajax, humiliated, driven mad by betrayal and grief, resolved to kill the Greek leaders in revenge. But Athena clouded his mind. Mistaking livestock for his enemies, he slaughtered sheep and cattle in a blind rage. When clarity returned and he saw what he had done, he could not bear the shame. He fell on his own sword, and the war lost another of its titans, not to the spears of Trojans, but to the wounds of honor. The Greeks, now weary, scattered, and Leaderless, faced a hard truth. Brute force had failed. The walls of Troy still stood, the city's heart still beat, and so they turned again to prophecy. Calchas, the ever-troubled seer, revealed that Troy could not fall without the presence of three essential pieces. First, the bow and arrows of Heracles, poisoned with the blood of the Hydra. Second, the son of Achilles, a boy raised far from the war. Third, the Palladium, a sacred statue of Athena, hidden within Troy's walls. So long as it stood, the city could not fall. Odysseus and Diomedes set out to recover these elements, driven by desperation and divine instruction. Their first stop was Lemnos, where Philoctetes had been abandoned years before. Bitten by a serpent and cursed with a festering wound, he had been left behind by the Greek fleet during their initial journey. His bow, once wielded by Heracles, remained with him. Odysseus, accompanied by Neoptolemus, the now-grown son of Achilles, set foot on the island, unsure whether diplomacy or deception would serve them best. Philoctetes, bitter and betrayed, refused to aid the Greeks who had cast him aside, but Neoptolemus, unlike Odysseus, was young, honest, and still unscarred by politics. Through his compassion, Philoctetes was swayed. He agreed to join the war once more, bringing with him the weapon that would slay Paris, the man whose actions had started the war so long ago. Next, Odysseus and Diomedes crept into Troy itself, under cover of darkness. They scaled the walls, infiltrated the city, and stole the Palladium from its sacred shrine. This act of sacrilege marked the beginning of the end. With the divine protection of Athena now removed, the fate of Troy hung by a thread. But one last trick remained. Odysseus, ever the architect of deception, proposed a plan so daring, so bold, that even the gods marveled. He would not break the gates of Troy with an army, but with a gift. The Greeks feigned retreat. Their ships, long arrayed along the shore, vanished into the horizon, leaving behind only a single offering. A massive wooden horse, towering and beautiful, rolled before the gates. Inscribed upon it were words of piety and farewell, a tribute to Athena, they claimed, for granting them a safe return. Inside the horse, hidden in its hollow belly, waited Odysseus, Menelaus, Diomedes, Neoptolemus, and a select band of warriors. These Trojans, exhausted and bewildered, stood in disbelief. Had the Greeks truly fled? Could it be over? Some, like Laocoon, a priest of Apollo, warned against bringing the horse into the city. He famously cried, "Beware of Greeks bearing gifts." To prove his point, he hurled a spear into the horse's flank, but even this act was not enough to save them. For just as doubt began to grow, divine intervention sealed Troy's fate. Two serpents, said to be sent by Poseidon or Athena, emerged from the sea and crushed Laocoon and his sons. The Trojans, terrified, interpreted the sign as punishment for his blasphemy. The horse, they believed, was holy. That night, amid drunken celebration and broken vigilance, the horse was pulled into the heart of the city. The gates closed, the watch grew lax, and as darkness fell, fate held its breath. While Troy slept, Sinon, a Greek left behind, unlocked the horse from within. The hidden warriors emerged, silent and lethal. They opened the gates, and the Greek fleet, having hidden just beyond the islands, returned under cover of night. Troy awoke to fire and steel. The city burned. The Greeks surged through streets and temples, cutting down soldiers, nobles, women, and children alike. No sanctuary was spared. Priam, old and regal, was butchered at the altar by Neoptolemus. Hecuba, his queen, watched her children die. Cassandra, the cursed prophetess, was dragged from Athena's temple, screaming warnings that no one would heed. Helen, the woman at the war's center, stood between her past and future. Menelaus found her, and though some say he raised his sword, he could not kill her. Her beauty, undiminished by time or guilt, spared her again. Others say she used words, tears, or perhaps nothing at all. In the end, she returned to Sparta. The fall of Troy was complete. Walls that had defied 10 years of siege collapsed in a single night of betrayal. The city that had once rivaled the glory of any kingdom was reduced to rubble and myth. But even in victory, the Greeks would suffer. Athena, angered by the desecration of her temples, cursed the victors. Storms scattered the fleet. Many heroes would never see home again. Agamemnon would be murdered by his wife. Odysseus would wander for 10 more years. Ajax the Lesser would drown. Diomedes would be driven from his homeland. The war had ended, but the cost had only begun to unfold, and Troy? Though ruined, it would live on, not in stone or lineage, but in story, in tragedy, in the hearts of poets and kings who would look to its fall as both warning and inspiration. It would echo through the ages, from Homer to Virgil, from Greece to Rome, from scroll to song. The fall of heroes was complete. The turning of the tide was not just the end of a war, it was the end of an era, though men clashed on the plains. Before Troy, and kings raised swords and empires in the names of honor and vengeance. No account of the Trojan War can be complete without understanding the gods, not as distant, indifferent observers, but as powerful, willful participants. Their rivalries, loyalties, and wrath were not incidental, they were fundamental. The war was not merely a contest of mortals, it was a drama written across Olympus, enacted through mortal hands, and paid for in blood and fire. From the moment Eris cast her golden apple, divine hands had shaped the course of events. The gods, divided by the judgment of Paris, had chosen sides and never relented. Hera and Athena, scorned by Paris's favor of Aphrodite, burned with a quiet, relentless desire to see Troy broken. Aphrodite, protective of her champion and the cause she had promised, shielded Paris and the Trojans. Apollo stood beside the city too, though his motives, as ever, were more enigmatic, sometimes noble, sometimes vengeful, always potent. But above them all was Zeus, who claimed neutrality, yet whose very will was entangled in fate. At times he favored the Trojans, at others the Greeks. He gave Hector strength, only to allow his fall. He permitted Achilles' wrath, only to mourn its cost. Zeus did not control destiny. He managed it, often reluctantly. The wrath of the gods, once whispered in omens and prophecies, became thunderous by the war's end. As Troy's defenses faltered and its towers collapsed, so too did the last illusions of divine impartiality. The gods no longer guided mortals quietly. They intervened. Openly, violently, Athena's anger was especially fierce. Once the protectress of Troy, she had turned against it completely after the theft of her sacred Palladium and the outrage committed by Ajax the Lesser. When Troy fell, and Cassandra, her priestess, cursed and defenseless, was dragged from her temple, Athena's fury ignited. She vowed to punish the Greeks not for victory, but for sacrilege. Poseidon, god of the sea, who had once helped build the very walls of Troy, now took satisfaction in seeing them fall. But his temperament, like the sea itself, shifted swiftly. When the victorious Greeks sailed home with bloodied hands and plundered treasures, Poseidon, in alliance with Athena, raised the waters against them. Ships were dashed upon rocks. Storms devoured fleets. What began as triumph turned swiftly to tragedy. The wrath of the gods followed every Greek ship. Menelaus, though he reclaimed Helen, wandered for years before returning to Sparta. Agamemnon returned to Mycenae only to be murdered by his wife Clytemnestra in revenge for the sacrifice of their daughter Iphigenia. Even those untouched by battle found no peace. Diomedes returned to find his kingdom hostile and was forced to flee to Italy. Nestor, the wisest of the Greeks, was among the few to return safely, but even he carried the weight of loss. Among the most cursed was Ajax the Lesser. For his violation of Cassandra in Athena's temple, the goddess struck him down during a storm at sea. He clung to a rock, cursed the gods, and was finally impaled by Poseidon's trident. His death was not just vengeance. It was divine retribution, swift and absolute. And Odysseus, clever, loyal, favored by Athena, was not spared. Though he survived the fall of Troy, his journey home was marked by endless trials, shipwrecks, enchantments, and divine punishments. His story would become another epic, another testament to the gods' power to bless and torment. But even as the Greeks suffered, the gods' vengeance extended to the survivors of Troy. Aeneas, son of Aphrodite, and one of the few Trojan nobles to escape, was spared, not out of mercy but out of divine design. For his survival, guided by the gods, would lay the foundations of Rome. In this, we see the gods not merely as destroyers, but as architects of a new order. The old world was ending. A new story was beginning. The destruction of Troy was not merely a military victory. It was an act of divine punishment. The city had become a symbol of pride, of betrayal, of divine favor squandered. Its fall was not only fated, it was willed. The gods had watched humanity from their mountain thrones, and when men strayed too far, when arrogance, sacrilege, and greed overcame the codes of honor and piety, they responded not with forgiveness, but with fury. Yet the gods themselves were not immune to contradiction. They demanded honor, but incited war. They punished hubris, but glorified vengeance. They protected mortals only to abandon them. The Trojan War revealed not just the folly of men, but the volatility of gods. In this way, the myth is not about divine justice. It is about divine complexity. The war's final moments were marked by silence and ash. The bodies of princes lay unburied. The city that had once shone with marble and bronze now smoldered in ruin. The gods had had their due. The oaths of men were fulfilled, but the cost was staggering. In the myths that followed, Troy became more than a city. It became a memory, a warning, a ghost. The wrath of the gods was not a single event, but a lasting echo, heard in every tale, of sorrow and heroism that came after. The Greeks, though victors, were scattered, cursed, and broken. The Trojans, though vanquished, would rise again in story, in Rome, in legend. The wrath of the gods had ended a war, but it had begun a myth that would outlast kingdoms. The dust of Troy had barely settled, its embers still glowing beneath toppled towers, when the echoes of the war began to fade, not from memory, but from the world itself. The gods had spoken through fire and fate, and now, the age that had borne Achilles, Hector, Odysseus, and Priam, was reaching its quiet, inevitable close. The age of heroes, sung by poets and praised by kings, did not end in glory. It ended in exile, madness, blood, and the slow unraveling of legend into silence. The heroes who had once stood at the center of a world-defining conflict now found themselves scattered across the seas, unwelcome in their own lands, broken by the very greatness that had once lifted their names above the common man. The long journey home, or nostos, became not a triumph, but a trial. Each hero returned to find that time, and the gods had not stood still. Agamemnon, High King of Mycenae and commander of the Achaean forces, had returned home to what should have been honor and rest. Instead, he walked into the final act of his own tragedy. His wife Clytemnestra, still seething from the sacrifice of their daughter Iphigenia, welcomed him with feigned warmth. With her lover, Aegisthus, she orchestrated his murder, striking him down in his bath. The king who had once commanded armies was reduced to a corpse behind a curtain. His death was not only personal, it marked the collapse of the unity that had bound the Greek kings together. What began as vengeance for a single woman now dissolved into a cycle of betrayal that would curse the house of Atreus for generations. Menelaus, brother of Agamemnon and husband of Helen, had also returned, but not immediately. The gods, still restless, delayed him for years. He wandered through Egypt, Libya, and the distant coasts of Asia before finding his way back to Sparta. Helen, the cause of the war, was by his side. Their reunion is shrouded in ambiguity. Did he forgive her? Was she truly guilty? In some versions, her beauty overcame his rage. In others, it was divine will that reconciled them. Regardless, the couple lived out their days in a palace that now seemed too silent for heroes. Ajax the Lesser, already condemned by Athena, perished during his return. As his ship foundered in a divine storm, he clung to a rock and boasted that he had defied the gods. For his arrogance, Poseidon struck him down, and the sea swallowed his name. Diomedes returned to Argos to find his position usurped. His people, resentful of his long absence, turned against him. Despite all he had done in the war, wounding, gods saving comrades, he was cast out. He sailed west and founded a new kingdom in Italy. Like many heroes, his final chapter was one of displacement, not homecoming. Philoctetes, bearer of Heracles' bow, also found no comfort in return. Though he had helped bring Troy to its knees, he too left Greece, settling instead in distant lands. The price of participation in the divine game was exile, not reward. And then there was Odysseus. His tale, a saga in itself, would take 10 years to unfold. Guided by Athena, tormented by Poseidon, he wandered from island to island. Tempted by goddesses, tested by monsters, punished by the elements. When he finally returned to Ithaca, he found his house filled with suitors and his name nearly forgotten. His victory, like that of all the Greeks, came not with trumpets but with quiet bloodshed in his own hall. Even among the Trojans, the survivors carried the end of their world within them. Aeneas, bearing his father and his gods on his back, fled. Troy with a band of followers. His destiny, whispered by the gods, was to found a new people, a new city. He wandered too, through Thrace, Carthage, Sicily, before arriving in Italy. There, he would fight again, lose again, love again, and become the mythic ancestor of Rome. In him, the echo of Troy did not fade. It transformed. But for most, there was no transformation. The age of heroes had consumed itself. The values that once defined this age, honor, glory, strength, were no longer sufficient. The gods had grown weary of men who defied them. The people had tired of kings who went to war for pride. The heroes had become too large for the world they inhabited, and the world shrank away from them. What remained were stories, told by bards in the courts of new kings, passed by firelight in villages far from ruined Troy, written down eventually by poets who never saw battle but understood the weight of grief. Homer's Iliad and Odyssey would immortalize these men, not as paragons, but as flawed, complex, and deeply human. The stories endured because they were not about perfection, but struggle. The age of heroes ended not with a great final battle, but with a scattering. Its conclusion was not a single death, but a fading. The names, Achilles, Hector, Odysseus, Agamemnon, remained. The men did not. What they left behind was myth. And what is myth, if not the shadow of truth cast across time? The fall of Troy, the wrath of gods, the broken homecomings, all serve to remind future generations that greatness often comes with a price, and that even the mightiest warriors must bow to fate. The age of heroes was a time of giants, but in the end, it was not their strength that made them endure, it was their stories. They live because we remember them, and we remember them because they remind us of ourselves. The war was over. Troy was a smoldering ruin. Its princes were dead, its temples looted, its people scattered or enslaved. The Greek fleet had sailed home beneath blackened skies weighed down by gold, women, and memories that would never fade. And yet, for many of those warriors who had fought and bled before the gates of Troy, the true trial was only beginning. Victory had been claimed, but home, peace, and redemption remained elusive. The gods, offended by the Greeks' desecration of sacred temples, especially the defilement of Athena's sanctuary, did not let them depart unscathed. Some were swallowed by storms, others driven far from their homes, and some found themselves cursed by betrayal, madness, or fate. The journey home became a new kind of battlefield, one where the enemies were not always men, but the sea, the gods, and time itself. For some, homecoming was swift but deadly. Agamemnon, High King of Mycenae, returned in triumph. His ships landed in the harbor, his men disembarked, and he walked through the gates of his palace to claim his throne once more. But waiting within was his wife, Clytemnestra, and her lover, Aegisthus. 10 years of resentment had festered in her heart, not only for Agamemnon's long absence, but for the sacrifice of their daughter, Iphigenia, made to appease the goddess Artemis. When he entered the palace, he was greeted with feigned warmth, welcomed with a feast, and then murdered in his bath. His death was not heroic. It was domestic, intimate, inevitable. His son Orestes would later avenge him, murdering both Clytemnestra and Aegisthus. But this act of vengeance would plunge him into madness, hounded by the Furies, and would only be resolved through the judgment of the gods in a new trial. Thus, the legacy of the house of Atreus, one of pride, vengeance, and blood, continued to unravel, showing that even kings could not escape the curses passed down through generations. Menelaus, Agamemnon's brother and the husband of Helen, fared better, but not without difficulty. After retrieving Helen from Troy, he was caught in a storm and blown off course, wandering through Egypt and distant lands. The gods tested him, especially Proteus, the shape-shifting sea deity who revealed that Menelaus could not return home until he made proper offerings to the gods. Only after years of travel and divine negotiation did he finally reach Sparta with Helen. Their reunion was complex. Some accounts suggest he forgave her entirely, others imply suspicion lingered between them. Was she a willing participant in her elopement with Paris, or merely a pawn of Aphrodite? Regardless, Helen resumed her place as queen, her beauty undiminished, and Menelaus ruled quietly until his death. In later myths, he and Helen were granted a form of immortality, dwelling on the Isles of the Blessed, where warriors and poets dreamed of ending their days. Other heroes met darker ends. Nestor, the oldest of the Achaean leaders, returned to Pylos with relative ease. He was among the few untouched by divine wrath. His wisdom, piety, and role as counselor had spared him the fate of others. He lived out his days as a respected elder, passing down the stories of the war to younger generations. In him, the age of heroes lingered a little longer, a flickering, light in a world turning slowly toward new gods and new laws. Diomedes, who had fought bravely and wounded even Ares and Aphrodite on the battlefield, returned to Argos to find himself betrayed. His wife, unfaithful and politically aligned with new powers, turned his people against him. Diomedes fled, ultimately founding new cities in Italy. His fall from grace served as another reminder that the glories of war did not always translate into peace at home. Loyalty in war was no guarantee of loyalty in peace. Philoctetes, bearer of Heracles' bow and slayer of Paris, was also driven from Greece. Though he had helped win the war's decisive end, his years of exile had left him, tainted in the eyes of some. He found little welcome in Thessaly, and eventually settled elsewhere, a wandering figure of both pain and prowess. Idomeneus, king of Crete, returned to find his kingdom in turmoil. In some versions of the myth, he had vowed to sacrifice the first living thing he saw upon returning home. If the gods granted him safe passage, that first life was his own son. When he fulfilled the vow, his people were horrified, and he was exiled. Another hero cast out by the very people he sought to protect. Even among those spared by gods or fate, the cost of war was evident. The Greek world had changed. The long absence of kings had left power vacuums, rivalries, and chaos. Homes had become foreign, sons had grown, wives had remarried or moved on. The heroes returned not to the world they had left, but to one that no longer had a place for them. The war had reshaped them and the world. Their stories were not passed down as perfect examples of virtue or wisdom. They were passed down because they were real in the mythic sense, full of contradiction, struggle, pride, suffering, and the inevitable reckoning that follows great violence. The homecomings were not merely the end of a journey, they were the judgment upon it. In the scattered harbors of Greece, broken men told stories of what they had seen. Some boasted, others wept. Bards wove their tales into song, reshaping memory into meaning. And as time passed, the names became larger than life, while the men behind them faded into history. What survived was not their victories, but their consequences. Troy had fallen. The fire that consumed its towers was not only the death of a city, but the extinguishing of a civilization. The streets once filled with music and worship now echoed with the silence of ash. Its gods, statues shattered, and temples, desecrated, had watched their people fall. For most, there was no escape. Priam was dead, Hector was slain, Paris had perished, the Trojan princes were gone. But among the ruins, one figure emerged, not crowned, not celebrated, but chosen: Aeneas. Aeneas was not a central hero of the war in the way Hector or Achilles were. He was a son of Anchises and the goddess Aphrodite. And though he fought bravely, for Troy his role had always been quiet, solid, enduring. His greatness was not in single combat or the roar of battle, but in his survival. He did not remain to die for Troy. He was destined to carry it forward. As the Greeks stormed the city, Aeneas was awoken by visions, some say sent by Aphrodite herself, urging him to flee, to gather his family, to carry the sacred flame of Troy beyond its smoldering walls. It was not an act of cowardice, but of divine mandate. Troy was ending, but its spirit would not be extinguished. Aeneas, burdened with legacy, would become its vessel. In the chaos, he gathered those he could. He lifted his aged father Anchises upon his shoulders. His young son Ascanius walked by his side. His wife Creusa followed, but was lost in the flight, disappearing into the night. Some say her ghost later appeared to Aeneas, bidding him onward, releasing him from grief. With what remained of his people, he escaped into the darkness, away from the flames into a new myth. What followed was not merely a flight, but a second odyssey. Aeneas became a wanderer, guided by visions and oracles, chased by storms, and haunted by destiny. His fleet sailed across the Aegean, seeking refuge and direction, finding only temporary havens and constant hardship. He visited Thrace, where the soil bled with Trojan ghosts. He stopped in Delos, where Apollo reaffirmed his fate. He sailed to Crete, to Epirus, to the Strophiades, each place offering some promise and each place proving fleeting. At every turn, the past clung to him, while the future remained veiled in shadow. At last, he reached Carthage, a new city rising on the North African coast, ruled by a queen named Dido. There, for the first time, he found rest. Dido welcomed him, heard his story, and offered him her heart. Their bond, brief but intense, became one of the epic's most tragic episodes. But Aeneas, though tempted, was not free. The gods, especially Mercury, the divine messenger, reminded him that his destiny lay elsewhere. He left in the night, bound again for the sea, and Dido, betrayed, took her own life. Her curse would echo through time, seeding the eternal hatred between Carthage and Rome, a grudge that centuries later would fuel the Punic Wars. Aeneas sailed onward, eventually reaching Sicily, and then finally the shores of Italy. But arrival did not mean peace. There, too, battles awaited, against the local king Turnus, against fate itself. Aeneas was not simply to survive. He was to conquer, to marry, to settle, and to lay the foundation of an empire not yet born. In Italy, he fought, not as a destroyer, but as a founder. The gods continued to shape his path. Juno, ever hostile, still sought to thwart him. But destiny could not be denied. Aeneas killed Turnus in single combat, and with that final act, secured a place for his people. His son, Ascanius, also called Iulus, would go on to found Alba Longa, and from that line, generations later, Romulus and Remus would be born. The city they founded, Rome, would become the heir to Troy, not in name, but in spirit, in myth, in ambition. Thus, Aeneas became more than a man. He became a bridge, from old to new, from east to west, from myth to empire. For the Romans, He was not just a hero, he was a forefather, a divine justification for dominion, a symbol of endurance and order. Where the Greek heroes returned to shattered homes and fractured legacies, Aeneas moved forward. His was not a return, but a creation. He did not mourn the past alone. He transformed it into a future. He carried his gods, his traditions, and his identity across the sea, embedding Troy into the very soil of Italy. In Virgil's Aeneid, written centuries later, this myth was elevated to Rome's founding epic. There, Aeneas is no longer simply a refugee. He is pious, obedient, heavy with responsibility. He weeps, he loves, he doubts, but he never strays from his mission. His tragedy is not in the loss of glory, but in the burden of fate. He becomes the anti-Achilles, not a man of wrath but of duty, not of momentary passion but of long suffering. He is a quieter hero, but one whose legacy would shape millennia. The survivors of Troy were few, but in Aeneas they found immortality. The city had fallen, its walls had burned, but its soul, carried on the shoulders of a single man, found new life. Troy was ash, and yet it endured. Its gates shattered, its kings dead, its women taken, yet the city outlived its own ruin, not in walls or in name, but in story. For Troy, more than perhaps any city in myth or history, became a symbol, a mirror, a warning, a yearning. Though it fell in flame, it rose again in memory, passed down through poetry, retold in marble halls, whispered by empires who claimed it as their spiritual origin. The legacy of Troy was not destruction, it was permanence, reshaped endlessly in the minds of those who came after. To the ancient Greeks, Troy was a lesson and a wound. It was a story of pride, fate, and divine will. In Homer's Iliad, composed centuries after the supposed events, Troy is not a mere backdrop for bloodshed. It is a world, with heroes who are complex, noble, doomed. Priam, Hector, even Paris. They are not monsters but men caught in webs, spun by gods and choices. The Greeks did not vilify the Trojans. They honored them, even mourned them, as reflections of their own values and fears. In the poem, the humanity of the enemy becomes part of the tragedy. Through Homer, the war became poetry, not propaganda, not historical record, but a meditation on rage, loss, glory, and mortality. The Iliad ends not with victory, but with grief, with the burial of Hector, with the pause before the final fall. In this, Homer transformed a myth of conquest into an exploration of what it means to be human. For centuries, Greek culture returned to Troy, not for celebration, but for contemplation. Tragedians like Euripides wrote plays that centered not on the warriors, but on the victims. The Trojan women presents the fall of Troy not as triumph, but as atrocity. Hecuba weeps, Cassandra raves, Andromache watches her son torn from her arms. These plays force Greek audiences to see the cost of their legendary victory, to confront the sorrow beneath the marble tales of heroism. Troy also became a geographic mystery. Scholars, travelers, and kings debated whether it was real, where it had stood, whether its fall was history or allegory. For a long time, the city seemed lost, buried beneath centuries of earth and doubt. Then, in the 19th century, a man named Heinrich Schliemann set out to find it, not as a poet, but as an archaeologist driven by belief in myth. In Hizarlik, in modern-day Turkey, he unearthed ancient ruins, including a city that had been destroyed by fire. Whether it was Homer's Troy or not, the discovery reawakened a fascination that had never truly faded. Beyond Greece, Troy's legacy took on new shapes. The Romans claimed Trojan blood as their foundation. Through Virgil's Aeneid, Aeneas became not just a survivor, but a forefather. Rome, in its grandeur and ambition, positioned itself as the rightful heir of Troy, not as a defeated city, but as a chosen lineage. Julius Caesar and Augustus traced their ancestry to Iulus, son of Aeneas. The empire that conquered the Mediterranean imagined itself born not from the victors of Troy, but from its refugees. This identification with Troy extended beyond Rome. In the medieval period, European dynasties and nations traced their origins back to Trojan survivors. The British legend of Brutus, said to be a descendant of Aeneas, claimed that he sailed to Albion and founded what would become Britain. The French chroniclers invented Francus, another Trojan scion, as the mythical father of France. Even the city of Venice, rising from the sea centuries later, invoked Troy in its mythic lineage. To claim descent from Troy was not merely a matter of prestige. It was to lay hold of the deepest traditions of endurance, nobility, and divine favor. Troy, though destroyed, became a sacred inheritance. Its defeat conferred greatness. Its memory bestowed legitimacy. Artists, too, returned to the story again and again. In Renaissance paintings, the Judgment of Paris became a favored theme, not for its war, but for its origin, the fatal beauty, the divine rivalry, the fragile spark that lit 1,000 ships. Later, Baroque and neoclassical artists depicted Hector and Achilles, the fall of Priam, the escape of Aeneas, not as myth, but as moral and emotional truths. The ruin of Troy became a canvas upon which human virtue and vice could be explored. In literature, the echoes of Troy are endless. From Dante's Inferno, where shades of Trojan heroes wander the underworld, to Shakespeare's Troilus and Cressida, which satirizes the war's futility, the legend remained vital. In modern times, authors like Jean Giraudoux, Margaret Atwood, and Pat Barker have reimagined the tale through feminist and psychological lenses, shifting focus from conquest to conscience, from glory to grief. The legacy of Troy is also the legacy of storytelling. Its myth became the seed of Western narrative tradition. It gave birth to the hero's journey, the tragic flaw, the rise and fall of great men. The war that began with a stolen woman and ended with a wooden horse established the template for epics, tragedies, and sagas to come. Even in popular culture, the Trojan War persists. In films, graphic novels, video games, the characters live again. Achilles fights on screens. Helen's face still haunts. The horse still rolls through the gates. New generations retell the story not because they must, but because something in it always feels familiar. Troy's endurance lies in its duality. It is a myth of collapse and continuity, a tale where victory is tainted and loss is transformative. It asks what it means to be remembered. Is it better to win and be forgotten, or to lose and become immortal? The answer, perhaps, lies in the silence after the flames, in the names that echo across time, in the fact that thousands of years later, we still speak of Priam and Hector, of Achilles and Odysseus, of Helen and Paris, not as ghosts, but as living questions. What is honor? What is love? What is worth dying for? Troy endures not because it burned, but because it mattered, because it still does. The Trojan War is more than a story. It is a cycle, a continuum of myth, literature, memory, and imagination. Unlike a single tale with a clean beginning and end, the Trojan cycle unfolds as an expansive tapestry of interconnected narratives, woven by different poets and cultures across centuries. From the earliest oral traditions to the refined epics of Rome, from medieval chronicles to modern reinterpretations, the Trojan cycle has been written and rewritten not to preserve the past, but to question, to explore, and to reflect the shifting human condition. The foundation of this cycle lies in the epic poetry of ancient Greece, particularly in the works attributed to Homer, the Iliad, and the Odyssey. Though we often treat them as complete and self-contained, they are fragments of a larger tradition, a narrative universe that spanned the full arc of the Trojan War, from its divine origins to its final aftershocks. The Iliad does not begin with the start of the war. It begins in its 10th year. Nor does it end with Troy's fall. It ends with a funeral. This choice is not accidental. Homer presents the war not as a grand tale of military conquest, but as a concentrated lens on rage, mortality, and the cost of glory. Achilles' wrath, the death of Hector, the grief of Priam. These are not mere plot points, but emotional and existential fulcrums. The war is not glorified. It is endured. In contrast, the Odyssey shifts the focus from the battlefield to the consequences. It is not about war, but about homecoming, about the lingering trauma, the changes time inflicts, and the impossibility of returning unchanged. Odysseus, though victorious, is weary. His journey is marked by longing, deception, and constant struggle. Through him, we see that victory is not an end, but a burden. Yet Homer's epics are only a part of the cycle. Other poems, now lost or fragmentary, once filled in the rest of the narrative. These include the Cypria, which told of the origins of the war, the judgment of Paris, the oath of the Greek kings, the first battles. The Aethiopus and the Little Iliad continued the story after Hector's death, introducing new heroes like Penthesilea, the Amazon queen, and Memnon, the Ethiopian prince, both of whom were slain by Achilles. The Little Iliad and the Iliou persists. The sack of Troy narrated the infamous construction of the wooden horse, the final assault, and the desecration of the city's holy places. Together these works formed a complete arc, from divine discord to mortal ruin. Though many have not survived intact, their echoes remain in summaries, quotations, and later works. They show that the ancients did not see the Trojan War as a single tale, but as a vast evolving mythos, one that embraced contradiction, multiplicity, and moral ambiguity. It is in Virgil's Aeneid, however, that the cycle undergoes its most dramatic transformation. Writing in the 1st century BCE, Virgil, under the patronage of Augustus Caesar, crafted a Roman epic that reinterpreted the Trojan legacy as a foundation for empire. In Virgil's hands, Aeneas is not just a refugee, he is destiny incarnate, chosen by the gods to build a new civilization from the ashes of Troy. The Aeneid is both continuation and commentary. It acknowledges Homer's influence while asserting Rome's superiority. Where Achilles is impulsive and destructive, Aeneas is dutiful and pious. Where Odysseus is cunning and self-serving, Aeneas is sacrificial and stoic. The Aeneid reframes the moral center of the Trojan cycle, aligning it with Roman ideals of order, discipline, and divine mission. Yet Virgil also injects sorrow and doubt into this triumphalism. Aeneas leaves behind Dido, who curses him. He kills Turnus not out of justice but vengeance. The new world he founds is born not of peace but of conquest. In this way, Virgil acknowledges the cost of empire, even as he celebrates its rise. As the classical world gave way to the medieval, the Trojan cycle did not disappear. It adapted. In Byzantine chronicles, Arabic geography, and European chivalric romance, Troy was repurposed to fit new cultural needs. In the Middle Ages, Troy was reimagined through the lens of Christian morality and feudal virtue. Geoffrey of Monmouth's Historia Regum Britannia claimed that Brutus, great-grandson of Aeneas, founded Britain. The Roman de Troyes by Benoit de Saint-Amour recast the war as a courtly epic, full of knights, tournaments, and honor-bound love. Even Shakespeare found space in this cycle, composing Troilus and Cressida, a play that mingles cynicism, eroticism, and philosophical despair. His Achilles is vain, his Hector honorable but doomed, and the war itself seems endless and absurd. Through this lens, the Trojan War becomes a commentary on human futility, on desire, ego, and decay. In the modern era, the Trojan cycle has been revived, questioned, and reimagined in myriad ways. Poets like W.H. Auden, novelists like Margaret Atwood, the Penelopiad, and historians like Caroline Alexander have all returned to Troy, not to retell it, but to reclaim it, to see it anew. Feminist retellings have given voice to the silenced. Helen, Andromache, Cassandra, Briseis. These women, long treated as prizes or footnotes, are recentered as protagonists. Their stories reveal that the cost of war is not borne equally, and that survival often demands resilience more than valor. Others have used the cycle to explore contemporary trauma. The siege of Troy becomes a metaphor for civil war, occupation, genocide. The 10-year wanderings of Odysseus echo the dislocation of refugees. The wrath of Achilles mirrors the rage of those broken by loss. The Trojan cycle, then, is not a closed loop, but an ever-turning spiral. It absorbs each age's questions, fears, and hopes. It is not static. It breathes. And at its heart is a paradox. We return to the Trojan War not because it was glorious, but because it was human. It reminds us that even in myth, there is no clean victory. Only loss and the stories we tell to give it meaning. Troy is more than a city. It is an idea, a symbol, a mythic construct built as much from memory and meaning as from stone and story. Over centuries, long after its walls crumbled and its inhabitants disappeared into history or legend, Troy endured, not because of what it was, but because of what it came to represent. For each generation, it has meant something different, a reflection, a warning, a dream, a ruin both literal and figurative. Troy has served as a mirror for civilization's ambitions, failures, and hopes. In the ancient world, Troy was a story of divine intervention, fate, and the limits of human pride. To the Greeks, it was the stage on which gods played out their rivalries, and men rose to tragic greatness. It was the city that withstood 1,000 ships, a citadel whose destruction proved that even the greatest walls could fall. In Homer's Iliad, Troy is not vilified. It is honored. The Trojans are noble, brave, doomed. The city stands as a symbol of human endurance and vulnerability. It is not just a place under siege, it is a civilization at the edge of extinction, clinging to its identity in the face of overwhelming fate. To the Greeks, Troy also functioned as a reminder of the cost of kleos, of glory. Achilles gains immortal fame, but only through his own death and the deaths of others. Hector dies defending his home, his honor intact, but the city he died for is reduced to rubble. The Greeks win, but what is left of that victory? Troy, in this telling, becomes the price of ambition and divine arrogance, of mortal pride and godly interference. For the Romans, Troy took on a different meaning. Through Virgil's Aeneid, the ruins of Troy became the seat of empire. Aeneas, fleeing the ashes of his homeland, carried with him not only his gods and kin, but a mandate to found something new. Rome thus recast Troy not as a final chapter, but as a beginning. It was transformed from a cautionary tale into a founding myth. The fall of Troy legitimized Roman expansion. It gave Rome a sacred past, a divine ancestry, a continuity from Homeric legend to imperial reality. Troy, in this Roman vision, was not simply destroyed, it was reborn. It became a symbol of resilience, of survival through transformation. The tragedy was preserved, but so too was the purpose. In this telling, destruction was not the end of, meaning it was its engine. During the medieval era, Troy's symbolism shifted again. No longer a pagan ruin or a foundation for empire alone, Troy became integrated into Christian genealogies and chivalric lore. European monarchs and nations traced their origins to Trojan survivors, not for spiritual or religious reasons, but for noble lineage and heroic legitimacy. To be of Troy was to be ancient, brave, tested. The British claimed Brutus as their ancestor. The French invented Francus. Even the Holy Roman Empire imagined a Trojan strand in its imperial thread. Troy thus became a symbol of continuity and legitimacy, a badge of honor in a world increasingly obsessed with bloodlines and divine right. It was not only a literary motif, it was political currency. But these medieval retellings often softened the brutality of the original myths. They transformed warriors into knights, kings into gentlemen, battles into tournaments. Helen was not just a symbol of desire and blame, she became a figure of courtly love. Troy was domesticated, reshaped to fit the ideals of the age. It no longer represented the end of an era, it stood for the ideals of loyalty, chivalry, and noble suffering. In the Renaissance, Troy was rediscovered in full classical complexity. Scholars, poets, and artists returned to the Greek and Roman sources, re-engaging with the moral ambiguity, the fatalism, and the human depth of the myths. The city once again stood as a testament to human greatness and hubris. In the age of Humanism. Troy became a lens for examining the tragic consequences of pride, power, and war. It was also a favorite theme in visual art. The judgment of Paris, the fall of Troy, the escape of Aeneas. These scenes appeared in frescoes and oil paintings, in sculpture and tapestry. The city became not only a symbol in literature but a dramatic image, a site of beauty and horror, elegance and collapse. Artists used it to explore themes of beauty's power, of temptation, of heroism undone by folly. In the modern era, Troy's symbolism has grown more introspective, more tragic, more nuanced. In a world shaped by industrial wars, genocide, displacement, and cultural disintegration, Troy has come to represent not just the fall of a city, but the fall of any city. It is the archetypal victim of war, the universal symbol of a people caught between the ambitions of power and the cruelty of fate. Writers like Pat Barker in works such as The Silence of the Girls reimagine Troy from the perspective of the silenced, the women taken as spoils, the enslaved, the forgotten. In these stories, Troy becomes a place not of kings and heroes, but of human suffering. The grandeur of myth is stripped away to reveal the trauma beneath. In war-torn modernity, Troy has often been invoked as an allegory for cities like Sarajevo, Aleppo, or Baghdad, places where civilizations have collapsed under siege, where cultural legacies are erased by fire and steel. Troy becomes not a distant myth, but an ever-present possibility, a warning that no city, no matter how proud or sacred, is immune to ruin. At the same time, Troy endures as a symbol of memory and storytelling itself. The fact that we still speak of it, that we still reimagine it, proves its lasting power. It stands as a monument to the human need to preserve meaning in the face of destruction, to tell stories, to remember, to resist forgetting. Troy represents fragility but also permanence, loss but also legacy. It is the city that always falls and always returns. In the great epics of war, voices rise like thunder, those of kings, warriors, strategists, and gods. Their words carve history into legend, valor into marble. But beneath that thunder, there is another sound, quieter, persistent, often overlooked. The voices of women. In the Trojan War, as in all wars, they were not merely bystanders. They were pawns and prophets, survivors and slaves, queens and captives. And while the epics largely focused on the deeds of men, the women of Troy carried a different, equally vital burden: the weight of memory, of suffering, of continuation. To speak of the women of Troy is to speak of a truth long muted. Their stories, of loss, resilience, agency, and silence, form a shadow epic, one not always told, but always present. Foremost among them is Hecuba, queen of Troy, wife of Priam, mother to 19 children, among them Hector, Paris, Cassandra, and Polydorus. In the Iliad, she is regal and composed, a matriarch pleading with her son Hector not to face Achilles. But it is in the aftermath, particularly in Euripides' Trojan Women and Hecuba, that her voice truly emerges. With her city in flames and her children dead or dispersed, Hecuba becomes the embodiment of noble suffering. She does not die with Troy, she lives to bear its ruin. Her grief is monumental. Her identity, once defined by throne and lineage, is reduced to widowhood, enslavement, and exile. Yet she remains defiant. She curses her captors, laments the gods, and in some versions, takes revenge. In her, we see the transformation from queen to symbol, of grief endured, of dignity surviving. Collapse. Then there is Andromache, wife of Hector and mother to Astyanax. In Homer's Iliad, their family unit offers a rare moment of domestic tenderness amid bloodshed. She begs Hector to stay within the walls, fearing for his life and the future of their son. He refuses, and she is left a widow, a mother, a prisoner. After Troy falls, the Greeks kill her son, throwing him from the city walls to prevent future vengeance. Andromache is taken as a concubine by Neoptolemus, Achilles' son. Her loss is total, yet her voice remains composed. She does not vanish into silence. Later myths recount how she helped build a new life in Epirus, raising a new family, adapting to a world remade by war. She survives, not as a queen, but as a quiet architect of continuity. Cassandra, daughter of Priam and priestess of Apollo, is perhaps the most tragic figure in all of Troy. Cursed with the gift of prophecy and the fate of never being believed, she warns her people time and again of the disasters to come. She sees the fall of Troy, the treachery of the Greeks, the danger of the wooden horse, and no one listens. After the fall, she is dragged from Athena's temple by Ajax the Lesser, an act of sacrilege that incurs the goddess's wrath. She is given to Agamemnon as a concubine, and in Mycenae, she foresees both their deaths at the hands of Clytemnestra. Again, no one heeds her. She is silenced not by her own voice, but by the world's refusal to hear it. Cassandra's tragedy is not only her suffering, it is her clarity, her insight, and her futility. Helen, the woman whose face, we are told, launched 1,000 ships, occupies a more ambiguous place. Was she abducted or complicit? A victim or a catalyst? In different versions of the myth, her role shifts. In the Iliad, she expresses regret, guilt, and affection. For Hector, for Priam. She is treated with a strange reverence, not hatred. In Euripides' Helen, a double exists. The real Helen was taken to Egypt, while a phantom was carried to Troy, an attempt to absolve her of blame. But whether symbolic or literal, Helen represents the dangers of idealized beauty, of desire, turned to conflict. She is not voiceless, but her voice is complicated, often filtered through the perspectives of men. Other women, often unnamed or briefly mentioned, carried equally profound burdens. Polyxena, a daughter of Priam, was sacrificed at the tomb of Achilles to honor his ghost. She met death with dignity, refusing to be bound, requesting to die free and upright. Her death is a stark reflection of how even in the aftermath of victory, the Greeks remained ensnared in cycles of violence and ritual. Briseis, a captive given to Achilles, becomes a point of conflict between him and Agamemnon. Though often treated as a prize, her laments in later versions suggest a woman caught between grief and survival, mourning Patroclus and navigating a world that commodifies her body and silences her voice. In these stories, women are not passive. They resist in words, in silence, in survival. Their strength is not forged in battle, but in endurance. They suffer not for honor, but for the choices of others, and yet their stories have endured, kept alive not in victory, but in testimony. Psyche, Trojan Women of Euripides, written in the 5th century BCE, is one of the earliest anti-war texts in Western literature. It portrays the aftermath from the women's perspective, Hecuba mourning her family, Cassandra prophesying doom, Andromache surrendering her child, Helen facing judgment. It is not a tale of glory, it is a dirge, a confrontation, a call to witness the consequences behind the banners. In modern times, the voices of Troy's women have returned with new force. Authors like Krista Wolfe, Cassandra, Pat Barker, The Silence of the Girls, The Women of Troy, and Natalie Haynes, 1,000 Ships, have re-centered the myth around them. They speak not just as characters but as commentators, on war, on power, on history itself. They ask, who gets to tell the story? Who gets remembered? Who is silenced? The Women of Troy remind us that myth is not only about heroes, it is about aftermath, about what happens when the songs stop. Their voices, once backgrounded, now ring clearly across centuries. Not to replace the epic, but to complete it. To understand the Trojan War is to listen not only to the clash of armor, but to the hush that follows. To hear not only the triumphs, but the laments. To see in the Women of Troy the enduring strength of those who survive what cannot be won. To understand Helen is to stand at the edge of myth and memory, of desire and destruction. Her name echoes like a wound in the bones of Western storytelling. Helen of Troy, the face that launched 1,000 ships, the cause of the greatest war, of myth. And yet behind that legend is a figure infinitely more elusive, complex and contested. Helen is not one woman but many, not one meaning but a mosaic of interpretations layered over centuries. She is at once an icon of beauty, a scapegoat, of war, a pawn of the gods, and a question that refuses to resolve. She begins in divinity. Helen is the daughter of Zeus and Leda, conceived when the king of the gods in the form of a swan seduced or raped Leda on the same night she lay with her mortal husband, Tyndareus. From that ambiguous union came 2 eggs. From one, Helen, and her twin Clytemnestra. From the other, Castor and Polydeuces. Her birth, already touched by strangeness, marks her as exceptional. Mortal and divine, beautiful beyond measure, she becomes a figure who bends the world around her. From her earliest appearances, Helen is defined by her allure. Poets do not merely describe her beauty, they submit to it. In the Iliad, the elders of Troy, watching from the walls, acknowledge that she is worth the price of war, even as they curse the conflict. Her appearance stirs not just desire but awe, something sacred and dangerous. She is not merely beautiful, she is beauty made, flesh, and with it comes both power and peril. But Helen is not simply a symbol. In Homer's Iliad she speaks. She is reflective, articulate, even remorseful. Living in Troy as Paris's consort, she refers to herself bitterly as a curse, a dog, a traitor. She mourns the lives lost for her sake. She respects Hector, who treats her kindly. Her tone is weary, filled with a self-loathing that suggests a woman caught in events beyond her control. There is no triumph in her position, only tension. Was she taken, or did she choose? This is the question that defines every reading of Helen. The Iliad does not make it clear. Paris is vain and impulsive. Aphrodite promised Helen to him as a prize in the judgment of Paris, after he named her the fairest goddess. Did the goddess make Helen love Paris, or was she enchanted into leaving? In some versions, she goes willingly. In others, she is abducted. The myth refuses to answer definitively, leaving Helen suspended in ambiguity, desired, blamed, and never truly free. In the Odyssey, Menelaus speaks of Helen with tenderness. When Odysseus's son, Telemachus, visits him in Sparta, he describes how Helen returned to him after the war. They lived together, peacefully. There is no wrath in him, only memory. But memory in Homer is fluid. It heals, it erases, it softens. The war happened, and Helen was its cause, or perhaps its excuse. Euripides, writing centuries later, brings new dimensions to Helen. In Helen, he creates a double, a phantom conjured by the gods who went to Troy in Helen's place. The real Helen, he claims, was taken to Egypt, untouched by war. Paris fought for a shadow. Troy burned for an illusion. The play is not about history, but about the ethics of blame. If the real Helen was never in Troy, who is responsible for the war? This version removes her guilt, but also her agency. It suggests a universe where men make war over dreams, and women are blamed for what they never did. Euripides forces the audience to ask, why do we believe the stories we're told? Why do we need someone to blame? In the Trojan Women, Helen is present again, but now on trial. The other women, enslaved and grieving, demand her punishment. Menelaus intends to kill her, but she defends herself. She blames the gods, Aphrodite's spell, the will of fate. Her arguments are logical, passionate, and unrepentant. She speaks as one who has lived through war and refuses to die for its guilt. The audience is left uncertain. Is she manipulating or merely surviving? This tension between Helen as victim and Helen as agent has never been resolved. It is why she remains fascinating. For some, she is a seductress, a betrayer, the archetype of femme fatale. For others, she is the first casualty of a war she never chose, punished for being desired. The Roman poets took a different stance. Ovid, in his Heroides, gives Helen a voice in epistolary form, writing to Paris, justifying her feelings, balancing between fear and longing. She is no longer silent. She is intimate, conflicted, human. The Aeneid, however, nearly erases her. Aeneas sees her at the fall of Troy and wants to kill her in vengeance, but Venus intervenes. The moment passes. Helen fades from Rome's founding epic, an echo, not a presence. During the Middle Ages, Helen's story was reshaped to fit new moral frameworks. Christian chroniclers recast her as sinful, a temptress whose actions provoked divine punishment. Yet in romances she was sometimes softened, portrayed as noble and misunderstood. The duality persisted, damned and idealized. In the Renaissance, artists and poets rediscovered Helen through the lens of beauty and classical revival. She was sculpted, painted, celebrated, as a muse, an ideal. Her image became an emblem of feminine perfection, her story a cautionary tale of desire's cost. In Christopher Marlowe's Dr. Faustus, her ghost appears as the ultimate temptation, prompting the famous line, "Was this the face that launched 1,000 ships and burnt the topless towers of Ilium?" Here, beauty becomes both transcendent and destructive. Modern interpretations continue to grapple with Helen's complexity. In Margaret George's novel Helen of Troy, she is portrayed with rich psychological depth, a woman torn between passion and consequence, aware of the chaos around her. In Madeline Miller's Song of Achilles, she is a background figure, distant but not demonized. In Pat Barker's The Silence of the Girls, she is seen through the eyes of Briseis, who views her with both pity and resentment, as someone privileged by her status, yet trapped like all the other women. Feminist retellings have sought to reclaim Helen, not to vindicate or condemn, but to explore. What does it mean to be the woman who causes a war? Who is she once the myth fades? In these tellings, Helen is not reduced to a symbol. She is rehumanized. Some versions go further, suggesting that Helen's myth is less about a person than about projection. Men go to war for pride, politics, and power, but they call it love. Helen becomes the justification, the mask. Her beauty becomes a battlefield over which male honor is contested. She becomes the vessel for society's anxieties about female sexuality, agency, and responsibility. And yet Helen endures. She appears in philosophy and psychoanalysis, in opera and fashion. She is invoked as a metaphor, a muse, a model. Her image, like her myth, has been painted and repainted across centuries. Helen of Troy is not a question of truth, but of perspective. She is not merely a woman of great beauty, but of great narrative weight. Her story is shaped by those who tell it, and in turn, she reshapes them. In the end, Helen remains enigmatic. Her name is a riddle that never quite resolves. Did she choose? Was she taken? Does it matter? What matters is that we still ask. Cassandra stands at the intersection of vision and silence. She sees everything, clearly, truthfully, tragically, and no one believes her. Her story is not merely about foresight. It is about being cursed to see and never be heard. In a mythos teeming with warriors and kings, she is the voice crying out before the fall, the seer whose words arrive too early to matter. And because of that, Cassandra has become more than a prophetess of Troy. She has become a symbol of every unheard warning, every truth dismissed, every woman silenced not by ignorance, but by disbelief. She is the daughter of Priam and Hecuba, a princess of Troy, born into royalty and raised within the rhythms of palace life. She is not peripheral, she is central. As a child, she is said to have fallen asleep in the temple of Apollo. The god, taken with her beauty, offered her the gift of prophecy in exchange for her love. She accepted the gift, but rejected the god. Apollo, furious and slighted, could not take back his divine power. So instead, he altered it. He cursed her. She would see the truth, always, but never would her words be believed. This punishment is not one of silence. On the contrary, Cassandra speaks often, with urgency and clarity. She is not cryptic, she is not confusing. Her tragedy lies in her very lucidity. She warns the Trojans of Paris's folly, of Helen's curse, of the wooden horse. She foresees the sack of the city, the blood that will flood its streets, the fires that will reduce its temples to ash. But her people, even her own family, dismiss her. They call her mad. They mock her. And so Troy marches toward its doom, blind not because it cannot see, but because it will not listen. To understand Cassandra is to understand the weight of knowledge when it is denied its power. Her pain is not only in witnessing the fall of her world, but in the isolation that comes from watching it unfold exactly as she predicted, unable to change its course. Her madness, if madness it is not delusion. It is the psychological toll of perfect clarity in a world built on denial. In Homer's Iliad, Cassandra appears only briefly, watching from the walls as Hector returns from battle. Her role is limited, but her presence suggests a deeper awareness. It is in later literature, particularly in the tragedies of Aeschylus and Euripides, that her voice expands. In Aeschylus' Agamemnon, Cassandra has been taken from Troy as a spoil of war, a concubine for the king of Mycenae. When she arrives, she knows what awaits. She foresees her own death, Agamemnon's murder by Clytemnestra, and the fall of the house of Atreus. She speaks in vivid poetic detail, crying out not only with divine vision, but with deep human dread. The chorus around her, wise, seasoned elders of Argos, listen, but do not believe. They pity her. They dismiss her words. And as she walks into the palace, knowing she will never leave it, she does not resist. Her final act is not one of flight, but of fatal acceptance. In this portrayal, Cassandra is not a background figure. She is a chorus of one, announcing the moral collapse around her. Her death is not only personal, it is symbolic. She represents the warning ignored, the future rejected. Her murder, like Troy's fall, is not sudden. It is the end of a long refusal to hear. Euripides returns to Cassandra in the Trojan Women, portraying her not only as a prophetess, but as a defiant voice in captivity. She is taken by Agamemnon, destined to die at the hands of his wife. Yet, she dances, sings, and speaks with wild, almost joyful abandon. She mocks the Greeks, celebrates their impending doom, and declares her role in the vengeance yet to come. Her madness here is theatrical, performative, a shield against despair. She is not broken. She is incandescent, even triumphant, in her knowledge that retribution is inevitable. But Euripides also shows the tragedy beneath. Her madness is her language, her armor. She sees too much, knows too much, and no one listens. Her words are wasted on the wind. In this, Cassandra becomes the embodiment of a woman whose power, intellectual, spiritual, prophetic, is tolerated only when it can be dismissed as hysteria. Across time, Cassandra's curse has transcended its mythic roots. She has become a cultural archetype. Her name evokes not just prophecy, but disbelief. In political discourse, a Cassandra is someone who predicts disaster and is ignored until it's too late. In psychology, the Cassandra complex refers to those who are unable to convince others of the truths they perceive. The term is often applied to whistleblowers, scientists, activists, and especially women, those who see clearly but are disbelieved because of who they are. In modern retellings, Cassandra's voice has grown louder. Krista Wolf's Cassandra reimagines her as a political dissident, a woman whose prophecy becomes resistance. Written in East Germany in the late 20th century, the novel recasts the Trojan War as a critique of authoritarianism. Cassandra is not simply a prophet. She is a thinker, a challenger of systems, punished not for being wrong, but for being right too soon. Her isolation is intellectual as much as emotional. She becomes a figure of conscience, suffering not only for what she says, but for daring to say it at all. In Pat Barker's The Silence of the Girls and the Women of Troy, Cassandra appears again, still cursed, still articulate, still unseen. Barker's work centers the female perspective of the Trojan War, and Cassandra's tragedy becomes one of many voices drowned beneath the shouts of men and the roar of history. But hers is the sharpest voice. She sees through the lies, the justifications, the pretenses of heroism. She names things, and that more than anything is her transgression. In these modern tellings, Cassandra is not only prophetic, she is political. Her curse is not merely mythological, it is structural. She is disbelieved because she threatens the order of things, because she is a woman, because she speaks truths that power prefers to ignore. Her character invites deeper questions. What does it mean to know something and be powerless to change it? What happens when society builds walls not just against enemies, but against inconvenient truths? Cassandra's story is a study in epistemic injustice, the harm done when someone is denied the status of a knower. Her fate is not only cruel, it is systemic. It shows how societies resist those who warn them, and how the cost of that resistance is often borne by the vulnerable. There is also a spiritual dimension to Cassandra. She stands in the long tradition of the truth-teller, the witness, the oracle. Like the Hebrew prophets, she speaks of what is to come, not with joy, but with sorrow. She is not honored in her own city. She is the voice in the wilderness, the dream that disturbs sleep, the conscience that cannot be quieted. Her power is not in what she does, it is in what she knows. But Cassandra is also a symbol of something deeper, the isolation of perception. Her story resonates with anyone who has seen what others cannot or will not see. With those who carry insight, trauma, awareness, and are met not with affirmation, but with denial. In that way, she belongs not only to myth, but to every era. Every time someone has spoken and not been heard, Cassandra has stood beside them. She is timeless, not because her story is old, but because it keeps repeating. In art, Cassandra has often been painted as wild-haired, eyes wide, arms outstretched. She is the woman just before the ruin, the final warning. In sculpture and stage, she is the tremor before collapse. In poetry, she is the last voice before the silence. Yet in all these portrayals, her tragedy never ends with death. Cassandra lingers. Her words, dismissed in life, gain weight in hindsight. Her story becomes prophecy fulfilled, not because it prevented disaster, but because it named it, and that is the ultimate irony. Cassandra is remembered not for what she said, but for what others refused to hear. Her gift was real. Her curse was social. She is, in that sense, one of the earliest figures in literature to experience the full force of systemic erasure. Her struggle is not against gods, but against the structure of disbelief, against the way power listens selectively, against the idea that truth must come from the right mouth to be valid. In the end, Cassandra remains a figure of uncomfortable relevance. She is invoked in times of crisis, of reckoning. She is remembered not as a queen or a warrior, but as a voice that cuts through myth to speak directly to us. She asks, when disaster looms, will we listen? Andromache and Hecuba were once the heart of a mighty empire. As queen and princess of Troy, they moved through halls of gold and temples of marble, revered not only for their lineage but for their poise, their strength, and their place at the center of the world. Before the Greek ships darkened the horizon, before the war turned gods against men, they lived in the rhythms of royal life, of rights, of family, of civic duty. But the fall of Troy did not only burn towers or break armies, it unmade lives. Andromache and Hecuba, survivors of devastation, embody what remains when power vanishes and grief becomes the only inheritance. To speak of Andromache is to speak of love and its violent undoing. She was the wife of Hector, the greatest warrior of Troy, and mother to their son, Astyanax. In the Iliad, their scenes together are among the most human. Hector meets her on the walls, where she pleads with him not to return to the battlefield. She knows his fate, and he too seems to know. But duty pulls him forward. Their parting is tender, painful, real. Andromache does not disappear into domestic silence. She is articulate, mournful, conscious of the war's toll. She stands not only as a wife, but as a woman fully aware of what war demands. Her worst fears come to pass. Hector is killed by Achilles and his body desecrated. Troy falls. Andromache is captured. Her son is ripped from her arms and thrown from the walls of the city by the Greeks. The rationale is chillingly pragmatic. No heir must live to avenge Troy. In that act, the future is severed. For Andromache, it is the end of her world, and yet she does not vanish. Taken as a concubine by Neoptolemus, son of Achilles, she is forced into a life defined not by choice, but by endurance. In Euripides's Andromache, she is shown living in Greece, still grieving, still mourning, yet still alive. Her strength lies not in vengeance, but in the ability to survive sorrow without losing dignity. She becomes a mother again, raises new children, and preserves the memory of Troy in a foreign land. Her royalty becomes internal, a way of bearing loss with quiet gravity. Hecuba, her mother-in-law, endures a different but equally harrowing arc. Once queen of Troy, wife of Priam, mother to a generation of princes and princesses, Hecuba loses everything. She witnesses the death of her children, Hector, Paris, Polydorus, Polyxena. Her city is destroyed. She is taken as a slave. In Euripides, the Trojan women and Hecuba, she transforms from monarch to mourner to avenger. In the Trojan women, Hecuba is the anchor of the play. She mourns, yes, but she also resists. She guides the women around her, Andromache, Cassandra, Helen. She offers wisdom, memory, and a kind of defiance through words. Her royalty, like Andromache's, survives not through power, but through a refusal to be diminished. In Hecuba, the play named for her, she becomes active. After learning that her last surviving son, Polydorus, has been murdered by the Thracian King Polymestor, she devises and enacts a brutal revenge. She blinds the king and kills his sons. Her grief becomes fury, and her fury becomes action. But this transformation comes at a cost. Hecuba, once the image of maternal dignity, ends her story howling like an animal. Some versions claim she is turned into a dog, symbolizing the total collapse of her humanity under the weight of grief. Yet even this metamorphosis can be seen not as loss, but as mythic embodiment. She becomes the pure expression of mourning, the voice that cannot be silenced even when it no longer speaks in human words. Together, Andromache and Hecuba represent different paths through devastation. One mourns and rebuilds, the other mourns and retaliates. Both survive. Neither forgets. Their survival is not romanticized. It is not presented as triumph, but as reality, as necessity. The war stripped them of status, family, autonomy, but not of memory. In them, Troy lives on. Not the city, but the culture, the sorrow, the witness. Andromache, in later myths, helps found new cities. She becomes queen in Epirus, a different land with a different people, but she carries the dignity of Troy with her. Hecuba, whether she dies in Greece or transforms into myth, becomes a permanent figure of lamentation. Modern retellings have returned to these women with renewed focus. Writers like Pat Barker, Natalie Haynes, and others have recentered the Trojan narrative around female endurance. These portrayals highlight what was always present, that the fall of Troy was not only a military or heroic catastrophe, but a human one, borne disproportionately by women. Andromache and Hecuba do not simply survive war. They carry its meaning. They are not symbols of hope, nor merely of pain. They are remnants of a world undone, still breathing, still speaking, and through them we are forced to ask not only what it means to win or lose a war, but what it means to outlive it. Polyxena was never meant to be a queen, never raised to rule or command legions. She was a princess of Troy, the youngest daughter of Priam and Hecuba, known more for her grace and beauty than for any claim to power. And yet, when the flames consumed her city and her family lay broken by war, She stood alone on the threshold between girlhood and myth, and stepped forward into a sacrifice that would enshrine her name. She enters the story late, but decisively. In the later myths, particularly in Euripides and in Roman retellings, Polyxena is offered as a sacrifice to appease the ghost of Achilles. After his death, the Greeks, guided by oracles and divine command, declare that Troy will not truly fall until Polyxena is given to the tomb of the man who had slain so many of her kin. Some versions claim Achilles himself had loved her, or at least desired her. Others suggest it was a posthumous demand, a final toll for his peace. But the reason matters less than the act. She is led to the mound where his body lies, and there she dies. It is not a death of savagery, it is ritual, and that is what gives it power. Polyxena is not dragged screaming. She walks, she speaks. In some versions, she refuses to be bound, asking only that she die with dignity. She bares her neck or chest, depending on the telling, and faces the blade with royal stillness. The Greeks who perform the sacrifice are awed by her courage. Her youth, her beauty, her composure, all make the act feel more sacred and more terrible. In this moment, Polyxena becomes something greater than a victim. She becomes a symbol of the last breath of Troy's royal line. She is the final offering, the last rite. Her death is not one of futility, but of transformation, of grief embodied as ritual, of loss given voice and form. Through her, the fall of Troy achieves its finality. Her sacrifice is not heroic in the traditional sense. She does not slay enemies or turn tides, but she chooses her manner of dying. She faces her death not with submission, but with solemnity. In doing so, she claims a power that war had denied so many, the power to define herself. Even at the end, her story echoes that of other sacrificial figures in myth and history: Iphigenia, Joan of Arc, Antigone. Women who meet death with clarity and strength, not because they sought it, but because it was demanded of them, and they refused to cower. Polyxena does not escape her fate, but she reshapes it. She makes it legible. Later depictions of her death reflect this complexity. In Roman mosaics, she is often portrayed beside Achilles' tomb, surrounded by soldiers, one hand raised in defiance, or prayer. Artists and poets linger on her final moment, the tension between body and blade, innocence and duty. Her image is not merely mourned, it is revered. The meaning of her sacrifice has been debated. Was she a scapegoat for Greek guilt? A ritual sealing the war's end? A narrative designed to elevate Achilles, even in death? Perhaps all of these, but one thing remains constant. She is remembered not for how she lived, but for how she faced dying. Modern interpretations see Polyxena through new lenses. Feminist readings often explore her agency in the face of annihilation. She becomes a figure of resistance within the confines of fate. She speaks, she stands. She refuses to be silenced. Her death, then, is not submission to male violence or divine will, but a confrontation with it. Others see in her a commentary on war's appetite for spectacle. Her sacrifice is not strategically necessary, it is symbolically charged. The Greeks have already won. The war is over, but still, they kill. And the victim is a girl, royal and voiceless, whose death serves no purpose but ritual satisfaction. In that, her story indicts the logic of war itself, a machine that demands closure through destruction. And yet there is power in how she is remembered. Unlike so many nameless victims of myth, Polyxena is given a moment of clarity, of poise. She enters the historical imagination not as a shadow, but as a presence. In her silence there is speech, in her stillness, defiance. Through Polyxena we are asked, what does it mean to die well? To meet violence not with resistance, but with presence. What does it mean to lose everything and yet hold on to dignity? She does not save Troy. She does not avenge her family. But in her death, she gives form to their ruin. She becomes its closing note, not a scream, but a final, unwavering breath. And in that breath, we find a kind of honor not built in triumph, but in how one chooses to fall. The Trojan horse is perhaps the most enduring symbol of deception in Western literature, a masterstroke of cunning that turned the tide of war without the swing of a sword. It stands as the ultimate act of strategy, the collapse of a city not through brute force, but through cleverness, manipulation, and the seduction of belief. In the long siege of Troy, where gods and men had fought for a decade with no decisive outcome, it was a lie, hidden in plain sight, that brought the walls down. The Greeks had tried everything. 10 years of battle had earned them countless skirmishes, heroic duels, temporary advances, but never the city. Troy stood. Its walls, said to have been built by Poseidon and Apollo, remained unbreached, and within, the Trojans endured, emboldened by their own heroes and the strength of divine favor. But time had worn both sides thin. Victory through combat seemed unreachable. It was Odysseus who proposed the unthinkable. Leave, but leave behind a gift. The idea was bold, theatrical. A massive wooden horse, hollow within, crafted with meticulous care and left at the gates of Troy. The Greeks would pretend to sail away, their camps burned, their fleets scattered. But within the belly of the horse, hidden behind sculpted flanks, would wait a hand-picked force of elite warriors, Odysseus among them. To the Trojans, the horse was both mystery and miracle, a sign of Greek surrender perhaps, a tribute to Athena. Some cautioned against accepting it. Laocoon, a priest of Apollo, famously cried out, "Beware of Greeks bearing gifts," and struck the horse with his spear. In that moment, the wood echoed ominously, but no one acted. Then came the omen. 2 serpents from the sea devoured Laocoon and his sons. The Trojans interpreted it as divine punishment. The horse was brought inside. What followed was not battle, but massacre. Under cover of night, the Greek fleet returned. The warriors inside the horse emerged, opened the gates, and let their comrades in. Troy was asleep, drunk on victory. By dawn it burned. The fall of Troy was not the result of the spear or the sword. It was the result of story. The Trojan horse is not merely a clever trick. It is a meditation on trust, on the vulnerability of pride, on how belief can be used as a weapon. The Trojans were not foolish. They were human. They wanted the war to be over. They wanted to believe in peace. The horse worked not because it was undetectable, but because it was desirable. In a broader sense, the strategy of the Trojan horse reveals a shift in the nature of warfare, from strength to intellect, from honor to subterfuge. It asks unsettling questions. Is it still heroism when the sword is replaced with guile? Is victory less noble when it is achieved through deceit? 2. The Greeks? The answer was complex. Odysseus was both praised and distrusted. His cleverness saved lives, ended the war, fulfilled fate. But it also blurred the line between wisdom and manipulation. The war that began with divine vanity ended with human cunning. The gods who once fought openly now moved behind veils. The lesson was clear. Power would no longer be held by the strongest, but by the shrewdest. Artists and poets have long returned to the image of the horse, beautiful, hollow, deadly, a symbol of artifice, of false peace. In Virgil's Aeneid, the story is told by those who suffered it, Trojans who saw not strategy but betrayal. In modern culture, the term Trojan horse has become shorthand for hidden danger, for sabotage disguised as salvation. The wooden horse rolls on, century after century, and what of the warriors inside? Their courage was real. Their task was brutal. They hid in darkness, knowing they would emerge into slaughter. Their silence was the prelude to destruction. Their stillness, more lethal than any army assembled in the open.
The Trojan horse endures because it redefined the end of the war. It was not an act of desperation. It was a masterstroke. It teaches that the sharpest sword may be the one unseen. The most dangerous soldier, the one who waits. And that sometimes to win a war you must tell a better story than the one your enemy believes. Troy did not fall in a blaze of glory. It fell in the quiet creak of wood, the turning of a hinge, the whisper of steps in the dark, and that more than anything is why it was unforgettable. The night Troy burned was not a battle. It was not a siege. It was an unraveling. For 10 years the Greeks had battered the city with swords, fire, and sacrifice. For 10 years the Trojans had endured with resolve, bolstered by the strength of their walls, their warriors, and their gods. But on the final night, all that steel had failed. It was not the spear that ended Troy. It was the door. They had opened it themselves. Within the wooden belly of the so-called gift, the Greeks waited in silence, breath held in ritual stillness. Outside, Troy celebrated. Songs rang from balconies, wine spilled in the streets. The war they believed was over. They had survived. They had won. And then, under the shroud of night, the Greek fleet returned. The signal fire lit the sky. The soldiers emerged from the horse and threw open the gates. The flood began. What followed was not war, it was slaughter. The Greek army poured into the city like a black tide. They did not meet resistance, they met confusion. Civilians woke to screams and smoke. Warriors reached for weapons already burning. No formation, no strategy, no gods. The temples were breached first. Athena's sanctuary, once the heart of sacred oaths, was desecrated. Cassandra, daughter of Priam, priestess and prophetess, clung to her shrine. She was torn away. The altar was soaked in blood. Priam, old and unarmed, fled to the inner sanctum with his wife and daughters. There, before the very statue of Zeus, he was cut down by Neoptolemus, son of Achilles. His death was not a duel, it was an execution. A king butchered like a criminal. Hecuba screamed. Helen watched. Elsewhere fires consumed mansions, palaces, libraries. Scrolls turned to ash. Children hid beneath beds. Mothers clutched their sons. Men leapt from rooftops rather than fall into enemy hands. The collapse was total. The city crumbled not just in structure but in spirit. Its memory burned as surely as its stones. The Greeks looted as they killed. Gold, ivory, silks, tokens of victory and symbols of shame. They dragged women by the hair through alleys once royal. They drank from goblets warmed by flame. The high towers from which Priam's daughters once sang now collapsed into cinders. The gods did not save Troy. Or perhaps they never meant to. The cries of the conquered rose with the smoke. Troy, once proud, now fell into the silence of ruin. And as dawn came there was no city. Only ash, among the few survivors. Aeneas escaped carrying his father, his son, and the weight of a people. He did not look back. There was nothing to see. The Greeks, drunk on destruction, did not all leave whole. Athena, enraged by the desecration of her temple, sent storms to scatter their fleet. Some died at sea. Others returned to homes that no longer welcomed them. The curse of Troy lingered, but the night of fire had done its work. The age of heroes ended not with trumpets, but with the crackle of flame and the collapse of stone. Troy became a story. A warning, a memory carried not in triumph, but in smoke. It had been a jewel of the world, and now it was nothing. Nothing except a myth that would never die. Troy did not survive, but some of its people did. In the aftermath of fire and slaughter, a scattering of souls emerged from the ruins, not as citizens of a kingdom, but as memories made flesh. They were no longer Trojans in any political sense. They had no city, no banners, no temples. They had only their stories, their scars, and the weight of what had been lost. These survivors would never again know peace as they had known it. Every road they took led away from home, but they carried with them the remnants of Troy, its language, its gods, its grief. In them the city's ashes found breath. Foremost among them was Aeneas, a prince but not a king, a warrior but not a conqueror. He had not been central to the defense of Troy, but his role emerged in its ruin. Tasked by fate and divine will, Aeneas fled the city with his aged father Anchises on his back and his young son, Ascanius, at his side. Behind them his wife perished in the chaos. Before them the long road to exile. Aeneas wandered as Odysseus would, but not to return, to rebuild. His journey led him through Thrace, Crete, Sicily, and ultimately to the shores of Italy. There he was destined to lay the foundations for a new people, one that would claim descent from Troy but rise in new form. Through Aeneas, Troy was not merely mourned, it was transformed. He bore not only survivors, but seed. Others were not so fortunate. Priam and Hecuba's daughters became slaves. Andromache, once princess and wife to Hector, was taken by Neoptolemus as a concubine. Her son Astyanax had been murdered. Her days were no longer governed by ceremony and grace, but by survival in a foreign house. Yet she endured. In later myths, she would go on to help found new cities in Epirus. Her royalty, once ceremonial, became symbolic, a quiet regality in exile. Cassandra, cursed prophetess, was dragged from Athena's sanctuary and taken by Agamemnon. Her visions remained unheeded until the end. In Mycenae she foresaw her own death at the hands of Clytemnestra, and she was right. No shrine, no temple, no mourning rite would remember her. But her story, the voice ignored, the truth that came too soon, would echo endlessly in every age that failed to listen. Helen, the woman whose beauty sparked a war, returned to Sparta with Menelaus. Whether she was forgiven or merely tolerated remains uncertain. In some accounts, they resumed their reign as if nothing had passed. In others, Helen wandered forever, unable to settle, her name a myth within a myth. For her, survival was not freedom, it was a lifetime of being looked at and never seen. The common people, unnamed in most records, were scattered to the winds. Some were enslaved. Some assimilated. Some disappeared. Their gods were absorbed into foreign pantheons. Their songs faded, but their sorrow did not. And what of the Greeks? They had won, but at cost. Many never returned. Ajax, the lesser, was drowned. Agamemnon was murdered. Odysseus wandered for years, their victory tasted of salt and smoke. Their homes were no longer what they remembered. In conquering Troy, they had inherited its curse. The fall of Troy did not end with a burning city. It continued in every footstep of the displaced, in every haunted memory of those who lit the torches or fled the flames. The survivors carried Troy with them, in dreams and bloodlines, in stories told to children born in foreign lands. Troy, the jewel of the East, was no more. But its people, scattered like embers, still glowed. They bore the weight of ruin and the burden of remembering. They could not resurrect their city, but they ensured it would never be forgotten. Not all survivors build new nations. Some simply endure, some carry the wound forward until it becomes a map, and some, like Aeneas, turn loss into legacy. Troy was ash, but its people, in exile, became fire. When Troy burned, the gods did not rejoice, nor did they mourn. They withdrew. Throughout the Trojan War, the gods of Olympus had been active, partisan, often indistinguishable from the mortals they watched and manipulated. They argued, fought, protected, punished, and seduced. The war was in many ways an extension of their rivalries, a mortal stage for immortal conflict. But when the flames consumed the city, the divine presence that had once loomed over the plain seemed to dim. The gods, like the heroes, had changed. At the heart of the war's divine origin was vanity. The judgment of Paris, a contest sparked by Eris and judged by a shepherd prince, fractured Olympus. Aphrodite, Athena, and Hera had all vied for the golden apple, and in its aftermath, each took sides. Aphrodite stood with Troy. Hera and Athena, spurned, lent their fury to the Greeks. Zeus, ambiguous and watchful, tried to manage fate without fully intervening. Apollo, for a time, shielded the Trojans. Poseidon, once a builder of Troy's walls, watched them fall. By the war's end, these gods had not only shaped the outcome, they had stained themselves with it. The desecration of Athena's temple during the sack of the city turned divine favor to divine wrath. Ajax the Lesser, who dragged Cassandra from the shrine, became the target of Athena's fury. His ship was destroyed at sea. Others who had committed sacrilege met similarly cursed fates. The Greeks had won, but the gods they had relied on now punished them for their excesses. The gods began to retreat. The age of their direct intervention was fading. They had grown weary of men, or weary. The war had not glorified Olympus. It had exposed its divisions, its pettiness, its failures. No temple built in the decades following could forget what had happened in Athena's sanctuary. No prayer could fully erase the memory of divine contradiction. In the mythic imagination, this retreat was not an abandonment but a shift. The gods became less present, less embodied. They no longer walked the earth so freely. Their presence moved to the margins, into omens, dreams, sacred fires. They became symbols rather than participants, objects of worship but no longer of war. Aphrodite, perhaps the most intimately involved in Troy's fate, continued to protect Aeneas, guiding him across the sea. But even she, goddess of love and mother to the refugee prince, acted with less visibility. She had won the judgment of Paris, but at what cost? Her victory had ended in ruin. Hera and Athena, triumphant in battle, found themselves dishonored by its aftermath. The desecration of their shrines, the excesses of their champions, the bitterness of post-war vengeance, these were not clean triumphs. Their worship continued, but their roles became more distant. In tragedy and philosophy, they would be reinterpreted not as warlords but as ideals. Zeus, who had tried to stay above the conflict, was no longer a mediator. He became a symbol of unreachable authority, invoked but less often trusted. His ambivalence during the war had set a precedent. Even the highest god could be complicit in suffering through inaction. And what of the Trojan gods? The household deities, the city guardians. They too went into exile. Some were carried by Aeneas. Others vanished into ruins. The fall of Troy was also the fall of a pantheon, not of Olympus, but of local devotion, of intimate household faith. The gods of hearth and boundary, of spring and grain, were absorbed or forgotten. Yet even in withdrawal, the gods were not gone. They became part of the stories that survived. They became metaphors, archetypes, forces behind fate rather than agents within it. The war had taught that even divine power had limits. That worship was no guarantee of protection. That piety did not always shield from ruin. In this way, the Trojan War marked the twilight of divine immediacy. The gods faded into myth, into art, into mystery. They were still prayed to, still feared, still honored. But they no longer bled for men. They no longer bled with them. And perhaps that is the greatest legacy of the war, not just the fall of a city, or the end of an age, but the quiet recession of divinity from the mortal world. A turning of the tide in how humans understood the sacred, from personal to distant, from walking beside to watching above. The gods after Troy were not dead, but they were changed, and the world they had left behind would never be the same. The Trojan War did not end with the fall of Troy. It ended with the exhaustion of meaning. In the early days, the war had purpose. It had a face, Helen's. It had champions, Achilles, Hector. It had gods who chose sides and men who believed their actions echoed through eternity. But by the time the walls fell, the purpose had frayed. The bodies had piled too high, the lies too many. Victory no longer felt like triumph. It felt like survival. And even that, only barely. The end of the war marked not just the ruin of a city, but the unraveling of a world. It was a civilizational ending, the collapse of an age that had defined itself by honor, oaths, prophecy, and divine favor. The Greeks returned home to find that nothing was as they left it. Wives had remarried. Thrones were contested. temples were defiled. Their war gifts were now burdens. Their names once glorified were questioned. And their stories retold in banquet halls and campfires began to sound like warnings, not celebrations. What ended with Troy was not just a military campaign. It was an idea that glory could be eternal, that the gods could be trusted, that war made men immortal. Instead, the war revealed that gods were petty, fate was cruel, and immortality could be bought only with suffering. The age of heroes ended not with a coronation, but with silence. Troy's fall became legend, but legend became lament. The poets did not sing of it with triumph. They sang of broken homes, haunted kings, and women led in chains. They sang of fire, of loss, of the stubborn weight of memory. Homer did not write a victory poem. He wrote a requiem. In that requiem, Troy becomes more than a city. It becomes every place that is destroyed in the name of righteousness. It becomes every family broken by pride. It becomes every war that begins with a promise and ends in ash. The war had begun with a stolen bride and ended with a stolen future. Helen returned to Sparta. Paris was dead. Priam slaughtered. Achilles gone. And those who remained wandered in the wreckage, searching not for treasure but for meaning. Even the gods retreated. Their temples, once stages for miracles, became sites of absence. Their statues watched the ruins with unseeing eyes. Humanity had outgrown the myths that once sustained them. Or perhaps the myths had grown too heavy to carry. The end of the war was not an explosion. It was an implosion, a quiet folding of an era into itself. The age of bronze gave way to the age of remembrance. The stories did not stop, but they changed. They became caution, not counsel. Echo, not instruction. And in that change, Troy found its final form, not as a ruin, but as a mirror. It showed those who came after what happens when pride eclipses reason, when prophecy is mistaken for fate, when victory is confused with righteousness. Troy ended. The war ended, but the world it left behind had to begin again, with smaller stories, quieter heroes, and gods who watched but no longer interfered. This was not the end of history. It was the beginning of memory. Troy, once a city of stone and flame, lives now as something more enduring, an archetype. Its story is told not only because it happened, or even because it mattered in history, but because it continues to happen, again and again, in new forms, in new names. Troy is not a singular city, but a pattern of war, of collapse, of the fragile illusion of invincibility, and of the human desire to believe in permanence where none exists. The pattern is always the same. A proud city, steeped in wealth, power, tradition, and legend. A provocation, whether by theft or love or politics. A slow escalation of grievances into violence. A long war with moments of heroism that mask deeper exhaustion. And then eventually, a crack, not just in walls or armies, but in the idea of the city itself. A betrayal, a deception, a fire. And after, not silence, but story. Troy as archetype lives in memory because it speaks to something deeper than myth. It illustrates how all things believed eternal are subject to time. Its fall is not an event. It is a revelation. A city cannot be saved by valor alone. Gods do not guarantee protection. Wisdom does not always prevail. And sometimes, the greatest threat comes not from the battlefield, but from within. In every age, there is a Troy. In every generation, there is a siege. Whether through empire or ideology, cities are built on the premise of enduring truth. They celebrate their golden age, erect monuments, define their enemies, and believe that the walls will hold. But time is undefeated. The walls always fall. The archetype is not only about cities. It is about civilizations. Troy is the shape that history takes when ambition meets hubris, when loyalty meets betrayal, when vision collapses under the weight of its contradictions. The city becomes the soul of a people. Its loss becomes their trauma. And in the ashes they begin again, or vanish. This is why the story survives. not just in books and ruins, but in politics, literature, psychology, and art. In every warning ignored. In every war started for honor and ended in shame. In every civilization that believes it is different until it repeats the same mistake. The Greeks won, but the Greeks lost. Troy fell, but Troy became eternal. The reversal is the lesson. The Trojan horse has become shorthand for sabotage hidden inside sincerity. Helen remains a metaphor for beauty that destroys. Cassandra stands for truth unheeded. Achilles represents strength undone by pride. These are not just characters. They are archetypes, inhabiting the roles we still play. Troy teaches that collapse does not come all at once. It builds, whisper by whisper, decision by decision, until it rushes in with the force of inevitability. And when it arrives, it does not distinguish between hero and coward, prophet and fool. It only consumes. And yet from that collapse comes clarity. The memory of Troy endures because it holds a mirror to the cycles we live within. It reminds us that war is never simply about swords. That loss is never simply about geography. That memory is not passive. It is survival. To study Troy is not to mourn it. It is to recognize it. In our cities, in our systems, in ourselves, it tells us that nothing lasts forever. And it asks with quiet insistence, what will we do before the next walls fall? Why do we still tell the story of Troy? Why does it matter that a city fell 3,000 years ago? That a queen was taken or left? That a wooden horse rolled through the gates? That fire swallowed marble? What makes Troy, amid the vast wreckage of ancient history, still feel alive? We tell the story of Troy because we are the ones who survived it. The war itself may be gone, the weapons rusted, the bones scattered, but the story endures because it became more than a record. It became memory shaped by myth, and myth shaped by those who needed to make sense of devastation. We do not tell Troy as it was. We tell it as we remember it, as we need to remember it. Myth is not about fact. It is about truth made livable. Troy became the story we use to understand why we fight and why we fall. It gave names to the forces we cannot see. Hubris, desire, fate. It put those forces in human bodies and gave them voices. It showed us what happens when we trust the wrong promise, when we ignore the right warning, when we believe glory is immune to grief. The memory of Troy survives because memory is an act of will. Poets, long after the war, sang it into being. Homer made it music, Virgil made it destiny, Euripides made it morning. Shakespeare, Giraudoux, Barker, and others have made it modern. Each storyteller retells Troy not to preserve it, but to ask new questions of it. Is Helen to blame? Was Achilles a hero or a weapon? Was Odysseus clever or merely cruel? Did the gods ever care? Each generation sees itself in the ruins. For the Greeks, Troy was warning and wonder. For the Romans, it was inheritance. For medieval Europe, it was ancestry. For the Renaissance, it was beauty and power. For the modern world, it is trauma, voice, and survival. For each it changes, because myth is elastic. It bends to reflect the fears and needs of the time. We tell Troy not just to remember the past, but to recognize it when it returns. We see the siege in our politics, in our media, in our wars. We see Cassandra in every unheard scientist or silenced activist. We see Hector in every parent who stands against fate. We see Helen in every person judged for what they never chose. We see ourselves in the survivors who carry their city on their backs into the future. Troy is not only a myth, it is the framework through which we explore memory itself. How do we remember what hurts? How do we tell a story that begins in desire and ends in ruin? We do it through myth, because myth lets us feel the shape of truth without being cut by it. The storytellers are not neutral. They choose which voices to elevate, which silences to preserve. They turn cities into metaphors. They turn screams into symbols. but in doing so, they give the pain form. And once pain has form, it can be carried. To tell Troy is to carry it. To remember Troy is to live with the knowledge that all glory fades, all pride cracks, all walls fall. But also, that some songs never stop being sung. Troy lives not in its walls, but in the breath of the bard, in the whisper of the page, in the eyes of the listener who sees not just a fallen city but a pattern. We tell the story of Troy because it asks us, what do we do with our ruins? And because in answering, we remind ourselves that stories are not just how we remember, they are how we survive. Troy did not end with its fall. It began again in Rome. The myth of Troy, once a story of defeat and ruin, was reborn as a tale of survival, of purpose, of destiny. It was Aeneas, prince, refugee, son of a goddess, who carried the ashes of Troy across the sea and planted them in foreign soil. In him, the Romans found not just a founder, but a justification. Aeneas gave Rome an origin nobler than conquest, deeper than conquest, an inheritance from the east, forged in fire, blessed by fate. Virgil's Aeneid crystallized this transformation. Commissioned in the shadow of civil war, under Augustus Caesar, the epic positioned Rome not as a new empire, but as the rightful heir of Troy. The poem is not merely about the journey of a man. It is the journey of a myth, from shame to supremacy, from victimhood to rule. Aeneas is not Achilles. He does not seek glory. He seeks obedience to duty, to the will of the gods, to the promise of a future greater than his grief. In him, the Roman ideals of pietas, sacrifice, and state transcend the chaos of Homeric heroism. Through him, Troy becomes Rome. This political adoption of Troy was deliberate. By claiming descent from the Trojans, the Romans positioned themselves as the phoenix risen from Greek fire. They were not the destroyers of cities, but the inheritors of civilization. Their wars were not acts of conquest, but of divine fulfillment. And this mattered, because Rome needed origin stories that transcended its brutality. The Republic had bled itself dry. The empire rose from ashes. Augustus needed not just power, but legitimacy. Troy gave it to him. Through myth, Aeneas became more than a founder. He became a mirror. Every Roman statesman, soldier, and citizen could see in him a blueprint: loyalty over love, sacrifice over self, order over chaos. In contrast to the wild, tragic brilliance of Greek heroes, Aeneas was tempered, noble, eternal. This appropriation of Troy extended beyond poetry. Roman temples honored Trojan ancestry. Roman architecture borrowed from the East and justified it as return. Even Julius Caesar traced his lineage back to Aeneas through Iulus, claiming divine descent from Venus herself. But the echo of Troy in Rome was not without irony. Rome, like Troy, would rise high. It would believe itself eternal. It would become the center of the world. And it too would fall. The politics of origin are always circular. By casting itself as the child of a destroyed civilization, Rome built into its myth the seeds of its own decay. It borrowed legitimacy from a people whose memory was built on loss. In doing so, it ensured that future generations would see in Rome not only its splendor, but its fragility. And so the story of Troy lives in every empire that imagines itself born of destiny. The British traced their kings to Brutus of Troy, the French to Francus, the Turks to Dardanus. Each empire reshaped the myth to suit its needs, wrapping itself in ancient fire to mask contemporary flame. Troy, once the victim of conquest, became the model of conquest. The ruined city became the blueprint of civilization. And that paradox is the power of myth. It can make ashes speak. In every age, rulers have used Troy to say, "We were chosen, we were forged in loss. Our rise is redemption." But in doing so, they forget the deeper lesson. Troy fell. It fell despite its gods. its warriors, its beauty. It fell because pride and fate are stronger than stone. Rome too would fall. And in the ruins, someone would tell the story again, not to claim descent, but to remember what power always forgets. Troy was a city of warriors, kings, temples, and towers. But when the towers fell, and the kings were slain, what remained were the voices of the women. In the ashes, it was not the spear that endured. It was the echo. The feminine echo of Troy is not loud. It is persistent. It weaves through lamentations, fragments of poetry, broken statues, and rewritten myths. It is Hecuba, weeping. It is Andromache, cradling a memory. It is Cassandra screaming the truth into silence. It is Helen being seen, not as a cause, but as a consequence. For too long, Troy was remembered through the mouths of men. Its legacy was carved by those who wielded swords and dictated songs. But in the quiet, the women of Troy endured. Not just in suffering. In resistance, in insight, in memory. Euripides heard them. In the Trojan women, he gave them space to speak, not as victims alone, but as witnesses. The play does not glorify war. It strips it bare. It lets the audience hear what happens after the gates fall. Not triumph. Grief, not glory. Ashes. Hecuba, once a queen, becomes a mouthpiece of mourning. She names what others try to forget. Her pain becomes a map of what has been lost. Cassandra, mad only because she is right too soon, becomes a prophet, not of the future, but of the pattern. She knows that victory without justice is a curse. Andromache, torn from her husband and son, speaks not of vengeance, but of the impossible labor of surviving with dignity. Helen, often blamed, is seen not as an object of desire, but as a subject of scorn and self-defense. Her role is complex, ambiguous. She defies the simplicity of guilt. These women are not quiet. They are made to be unheard. In modern literature, their voices have grown louder. Writers like Pat Barker, Natalie Haynes, Margaret Atwood, and Krista Wolfe have returned to Troy, not to retell the epic, but to reroute it. To shift the camera. To ask, what does war look like when the hero is not the man with the sword, but the woman cleaning blood from the temple floor? This shift is not a correction. It is a restoration. The feminine echo is not simply reactive. It is interpretive. It sees what others miss. It holds memory in ways that banners and battlefields cannot. It carries the story through generations, not in monuments, but in words, in lullabies, in warnings. To hear this echo is to confront the myth from its margins. It is to recognize that the cost of war is often paid by those who never chose it. That power, when unchecked, writes over the soft truths with loud lies. The women of Troy are not passive. They are complex. They are capable of fury, of wisdom, of manipulation, of despair. They are not ideals. They are humans. And through them, we are reminded that history is not only what survives, it is what is remembered. And memory belongs not only to those who build, but to those who endure the collapse. The feminine echo of Troy does not seek revenge. It seeks voice. And once that voice is heard, the story cannot be told the same way again. Troy is still falling, in every place where silence follows violence. But the echo grows, and it is not finished speaking. Troy never ends. It is not bound to a place, a year, or a single war. It is a cycle, a rhythm, a haunting. Troy burns, and then it is reborn. Not in stone, but in story. Not in politics, but in the patterns of our fears. Each time a nation is shattered by pride, each time a people fall for a false promise, each time a city is torn from within before it is taken from without, Troy returns. We have never stopped needing it. Troy is the story we tell when we feel the world tipping. It is the story of what happens when beauty is weaponized, when truth is ignored, when strength becomes arrogance. It is the myth we reach for when logic fails to explain how so much could fall so fast. In every war that promises to be swift and ends in ruin, in every ideology that begins with purity and ends in persecution, in every golden age that turns to ash, we hear the creak of the wooden horse. Troy never ends because we never stop building walls. And we never stop hiding danger behind gifts. It is not the battle that repeats. It is the blindness, the trust in invincibility, the refusal to listen to those who see the danger coming, the insistence that our walls are higher, our gods more faithful, our cause more just. The myth endures because it reflects us, not as we wish to be, but as we are. Fragile, forgetful, glorious, repeating. The eternal return of Troy is not punishment. It is memory misused. It is story without heed. We carry the pattern in our stories, our literature, our dreams. We name cities after it. We teach it in schools. We invoke it in headlines. Troy becomes shorthand for hubris undone, for civilization breached from within, for the moment just before collapse. But the lesson is not only in the fall, it is in the aftermath. What do we do with the ruins? Do we listen this time, or do we rebuild with the same cracks in the foundation? Aeneas flees. Cassandra is silenced. Helen returns. Odysseus wanders. Each character carries a piece of the myth's recursion. Each bears a role we might one day play. Troy never ends because we need the reminder. We need it to ask, are we building something that lasts, or something that burns beautifully? And when we tell the story again, as we will, as we must ask not just what caused the fall, but what might have prevented it. Maybe Troy is not only a warning. Maybe it is a question, and we are still searching for the answer. The story of Troy is not linear. It is a spiral. It begins not with a single cause, but with a weave of desires, deceptions, and divine provocations. And as it unfolds through battles, love, prophecy, and flame, it never quite ends. Instead, it circles back on itself, returning, in different forms, in different tongues, with new questions. The shape of the story resists conclusion. It invites retelling. Each generation reshapes Troy according to its fears, its hopes, its wounds. And in that, the myth achieves what history cannot: timelessness. Not because it avoids change, but because it embraces it. Troy begins with a choice: the judgment of Paris. A shepherd prince, asked to choose the fairest of goddesses, unwittingly chooses destruction. This moment, infused with beauty, rivalry, and fate, sets in motion the longest war in myth. But this origin is not simple. It tells us that even the most personal decisions, a judgment of beauty, can ripple outward into catastrophe. The spiral begins. From that judgment grows a war not merely of armies, but of ideals. Each character enters the spiral with a different motive. Achilles seeks glory, Hector seeks honor. Odysseus seeks resolution, Helen seeks peace, or perhaps redemption. The gods interfere, not because they must, but because they mirror human pettiness, magnified by immortality. The story gains dimension. It curves back on itself with every death, every delay. The structure of the narrative resists closure. The Iliad ends not with victory, but with a funeral. The Odyssey ends not with homecoming, but with estrangement. The Aeneid ends not with foundation, but with vengeance. Each epic, while bearing the mark of an ending, opens into something unresolved. That is the genius of Troy. It never truly concludes. As the centuries pass, the spiral expands. Euripides focuses on the women. Virgil retells the end as a beginning. Medieval writers turned the war into ancestry. Modern writers give voice to those previously silent. Each retelling is a new coil in the spiral, adding depth without closing the loop. In a linear story, cause and effect rule. In a spiral, meaning builds with each revolution. Themes return with new inflection. Troy is not only about what happened. It is about how it is told. Who tells it, who is left out, what is emphasized, and what is repressed. Even in education, we teach Troy not as fixed history, but as layered text. Students debate who is to blame, what is real, why it endures. The myth becomes a mirror of inquiry. It reflects the methods of its transmission, oral to written, epic to fragment, poetry to philosophy. Its form is its message, and because the spiral welcomes all interpretations, it allows contradiction. Helen can be both victim and instigator. Achilles both hero and butcher. Troy both city and symbol. The narrative coils around these paradoxes without flattening them. It survives because it does not insist on a single truth. As a result, the shape of the story becomes a model for myth itself. It teaches that stories live longest when they resist closure, when they grow with the tellers, when they reflect rather than instruct. The spiral form is also emotional. It mimics grief. We return to the same questions, the same memories, not to solve them, but to feel them again, differently. We mourn Hector not once, but many times. We revisit Cassandra's warnings in every new tragedy. We watch the horse roll in, knowing what it holds, feeling powerless to stop it. The spiral is the shape of remembrance. And finally, the spiral is the shape of time. Troy reminds us that history is not a straight path from ignorance to enlightenment, but a circuit of repetition and recognition. We see Troy in Sarajevo, in Baghdad, in Mariupol. Each time we recognize the pattern, the story begins again. So the shape of Troy's story is not a flaw. It is its genius. It allows return. It allows reinterpretation. It refuses to end, because it knows that the end is never the end. It is the moment before the next telling, and in that, Troy remains alive. Not in its stones, but in its spiral. Not in its conclusion, but in its echo. Thus the story continues. Troy begins in memory, but it does not stay there. It moves slowly, deliberately, from the vault of remembrance into the world of interpretation. It becomes meaning, not fixed, not singular, but plural and pliable. The myth does not just tell us what happened. It helps us ask why it matters, and why it keeps returning. What begins as memory, a fire, a fall, a name, becomes myth because it survives being forgotten by becoming useful. Troy is not remembered in spite of its ruin. It is remembered because its ruin became a lesson. Memory alone is too fragile. Myth is memory with intention. It carries values, fears, and questions forward, wrapping history in symbols until meaning can be carried across generations. The image of the Trojan horse, for example, no longer requires explanation. It is embedded in the modern mind as a symbol of betrayal, of the danger hidden behind beauty. Helen is no longer just a woman in a war story. She is the embodiment of the tension between desire and destruction. Achilles is not simply a warrior, but a meditation on rage, pride, and mortality. Each element of the myth has become a metaphor, alive in culture, politics, psychology. In classrooms, Troy is taught not merely as ancient literature, but as a way to understand narrative construction, cultural transmission, and ethical ambiguity. Why do people fight wars? What is the cost of honor? Who gets remembered? These are not ancient questions. They are questions of today, refracted through the memory of a burning city. Artists have used Troy to speak about everything from empire to exile. Writers have used its characters to illuminate trauma and transformation. The myth has been adapted into opera, into film, into protest. And in that pliability lies its strength. Memory tends to fade unless it finds a form that fits the present. That is what myth does. It updates memory into relevance. It makes sure the names still resonate. Consider how Helen has changed over time, from seductress to victim, from scapegoat to survivor. Each retelling reshapes the memory to reflect new understandings of agency, gender, power. The same is true for Cassandra, whose madness was once a punishment and is now often read as insight denied. Or for Andromache, whose grief is now seen not only as mourning, but as testimony. Myth also democratizes memory. It allows stories to survive outside of archives. Troy is not known because of royal records. It is known because people kept telling it, at fires, in markets, on stages. Myth does what memory alone cannot. It adapts. It is not static. It evolves, and in doing so, it spreads. Troy moved from Greek oral tradition to Roman epic, from medieval chronicles to Renaissance painting, from 26th century literature to digital animation. The memory is not lost, it is transmuted. Even the survivors become carriers of meaning. Aeneas, who leaves rather than defends, becomes the model of founding through loss. His journey is not about vengeance, but about transformation. His memory is not static. It is a map. Meaning arises not just in what is told, but in what is questioned. Did the war need to happen? Was the fall inevitable? These are memory's cracks. Myth grows through them. Memory wants to remember. Myth wants to understand. In that way, Troy becomes a template for turning pain into possibility. Its fall is not just an end. It is an opening. It creates the space for reflection, for reimagining. And that is perhaps its greatest contribution. It models how we turn loss into language. How we take what burns and make it instructive. This transformation from memory to meaning also affects how Troy enters our personal and collective identity. Cultures adopt the myth not just to remember the past, but to define themselves against it. Rome claimed descent from Aeneas, not just for legitimacy, but to reinterpret destruction as divine destiny. The British and French traced their kings to Trojan bloodlines, using Troy not as tragedy, but as foundation. These adaptations show how deeply myth can shape the self-image of a people. In modern times, Troy has become a space for critique. Feminist writers return to it to expose the silencing of women. Political theorists use it to interrogate power and imperialism. Therapists reference it to describe trauma and memory. Its utility evolves because its form does, from epic to novel, from theater to cinema. Each version of Troy carries a new reflection, a new question. It is also personal. For individuals, Troy can be the memory of a loss, the fall of a dream, the betrayal by a friend. The metaphors embedded in the myth resonate with emotional truth. We each have our own Troys, loved, defended, lost, and in remembering them, we seek meaning too, from memory to meaning. This is how Troy survives, and how it lives. Silence is not the absence of sound, it is the presence of what is withheld. In the story of Troy, what is most profound is not always what is shouted from the battlefield or proclaimed by kings. It is what remains unspoken in the cries of the enslaved, in the quiet mourning of widows, in the unheard prophecies, and in the erasure of those who carried the weight of loss without the luxury of glory. The story of Troy, as preserved in the major epics, is loud with the voices of men. Heroes clash, generals speak, poets sing. But the silence surrounding the lives of others, especially women, children, servants, the fallen, demands our attention just as fiercely. To listen to Troy fully, we must hear the voices that history muted. Euripides began this work in the Trojan Women, where silence becomes the stage. Punguba, Andromache, Cassandra, Helen, they speak, but they are not heard by the world that surrounds them. They speak to us, across time. Their pain, stripped of ornament, confronts the audience with truths that Homer did not center. These are not tales of conquest, they are songs of survival. To listen to the silence means to ask who is not here, who is missing from the story. What do their absences tell us? There are no songs for the children of Troy thrown from the walls, no prayers for the servant girls taken aboard Greek ships, no memorials for the unnamed dead. Their silence is not empty, it is full of meaning we have yet to retrieve. Modern retellings attempt to fill these silences. Writers like Krista Wolf, Pat Barker, Natalie Haynes, and Madeline Miller offer perspectives that center the silenced. These works do not invent voices, they recover them. They imagine what was always there, but left unspoken. In doing so, they alter the very frame of the myth. But silence is not only about omission, it is also about suppression. Cassandra's voice, cursed by Apollo, becomes a metaphor for all truths dismissed by power. She sees clearly, but is labeled insane. Her silence is not hers, it is imposed. That imposition has echoed through history. When women are told their grief is irrational, when trauma is ignored, when memory is disbelieved. The silence also belongs to the aftermath. After the fires die, after the cities fall, who tells the story? And who listens? Silence often follows catastrophe, not because there is nothing to say, but because those left behind have no platform to speak. Listening to the silence also means recognizing its power. Silence can protect, resist, mourn, remember. It can say what words cannot. In the ruins of Troy, silence was not a void, it was a testimony. Each silence in the myth is an invitation to listen with new ears, not only to what is said, but to what is implied, to the space between the lines, to the pauses, to the breath held too long. To teach Troy today, without addressing its silences, is to perpetuate them. We must read the absences as carefully as the verses. We must notice which characters disappear, and which voices are never given space. That noticing is the beginning of justice. The silence of Troy also mirrors the silences in our world, the refugee without a name, the victim without a record, the people whose cities burn and whose stories are consumed by noise. Troy is not just ancient, its silences are modern, and in those silences, we find not emptiness, but resonance. To listen to the silence is to hear the full myth, and to finally begin the work of telling it completely. Silence, when fully heard, becomes legacy. It becomes a form of transmission between generations. It moves through the language of ritual, of song, of unrecorded memory. In many cultures, what is not said aloud is no less sacred. It is often more so. The unspeakable becomes a core around which communities gather. Troy's silences hold similar gravity. They create space where the unspeakable might still be understood. Consider the silent gestures within the myth. Andromache gathering, Hecuba folding herself beside her fallen husband, Helen lowering her eyes as Troy collapses. These actions speak beyond words. They transmit experience. They demand empathy without translation. Silence in these moments is not absence, it is full presence. We also hear silence in the omissions of victory. The Greeks do not speak of their guilt. There are no grand speeches from the conquerors about justice or righteousness. The silence after the burning of Troy is heavy not just with grief, but with complicity. The audience is left to imagine what remains unsaid, and in that imagination, the silence gains power. In this way, listening to the silence becomes a form of ethical engagement. It asks us not to fill the void, but to sit with it. To bear witness, to accept that some pain cannot be narrated, only acknowledged. In literature, silence has become a technique of resistance. Writers pause, withhold, or break form to force the reader into reflection. Silence slows the pace. It asks us to dwell, to recognize the limits of language and the depth of experience beyond articulation. Troy's myth, revisited with this in mind, becomes not just a narrative, but a meditation. So let us end this sub-bloco, not with more words, but with what the silence asks. What are we still not hearing? Whose stories remain untold, and how will we change the telling? When the last flame died down in Troy, and the smoke joined the sky, like an unbroken sigh, what remained was not the marble, not the myths of gods, not the gold taken from broken chambers. What remained was something deeper, quieter, and more lasting, the story. The story and its hold on us. In ruins we often seek relics, artifacts that can prove what was. But what remains from Troy is not a relic. It is a living question. What does it mean to fall? And what does it mean to survive? Not just the event, but the memory of the event. From the very beginning, Troy was more than a city. It was an idea. And ideas, when destroyed, don't disappear. They echo. The war was fought for a woman, or for pride, or for prophecy. But what remained was never singular. It was a chorus of meanings, changing with each age. For some, Troy was a mirror. For others, a prophecy. For still others, a heritage. And so Troy lived on in fragments. In the poetry of Homer, in the lamentations of Euripides, in Virgil's hope and Ovid's irony, in the eyes of artists, the maps of empire builders, the scripts of playwrights. What remained was not stone, it was speech. To say Troy, even now, is to invoke not a city but a world, and that world is made of layers. The heroism and the horror, the beauty and the betrayal, the silence and the screaming, the hope of those who rebuilt, the guilt of those who returned. The myth did not preserve only what happened, it preserved how it was felt. What remains too are the voices we have only just begun to listen to. The women, the enslaved, the children, the forgotten. Their suffering did not stop when the flames went out. Their stories persisted, often untold, but alive in memory, in the tremor of each new telling. In every age, Troy has meant something different, but in each retelling, what remains consistent is the sense that this myth is unfinished, that even in its ruin, there is more to say, and that is perhaps the greatest legacy of Troy. It invites us not to conclude, but to continue. Troy remains in language, in the metaphors we speak without even realizing, the Trojan horse in digital warfare, the Cassandra warning in science and society, the Helen in every unjustified war, the Aeneas in every refugee. Troy remains in the shape of mourning, in how we remember what we lose, in how we keep asking questions we cannot fully answer, in how we build cities that will one day fall, and write songs so they won't be forgotten. Troy remains because we keep it alive. We carry it forward, sometimes knowingly, sometimes by instinct, and maybe that's what matters more than anything. Not just what remains, but that something does. A feeling, a caution, a story that asks us, every time we tell it, to see ourselves anew. It also remains in warning. Each generation that inherits Troy also inherits its dangers. The myth reminds us not just of what was lost, but of what can be lost again. Its structures, both narrative and political, reveal the fault lines we live among. When we speak of Troy, we speak of the fragility of power, the volatility of pride, and the weight of misjudged silence. These are not ancient lessons, they are present ones. What remains are the questions, and the willingness to ask them. Why do we glorify conflict? Why do we dismiss the prophetic? Why are the voices of women still so easily distorted or ignored? Why do we continue to rebuild what will be broken again? Troy's endurance lies not in a monument, but in its use. Each time it is invoked, as art, as history, as parable, it transforms again. Not fixed, not static, but dynamic and relevant. What remains is a myth that refuses to become irrelevant. And in that refusal, it becomes more than memory, it becomes legacy. There is no final word to Troy, only the attempt at one, only the effort to gather what is left, to hold it still long enough for meaning to settle, like ash after fire. The story resists conclusion. It coils, it circles, it reverberates. Still, we try to say something that will make the weight of its telling feel worthwhile. Still, we reach for words that will steady the ruins and let us walk away with understanding. Perhaps the final word is not a word at all, but a choice to remember, to return, to retell. Every generation that meets Troy reshapes it. What was once a legend of valor becomes a tragedy of silence. What was once about kings and gods becomes about civilians, survivors, children. The myth lives because it flexes, because we need it to. And in the need is the key. Troy remains not because it is fixed in history, but because it is unfixed in meaning. It becomes what we require it to be. In times of peace, it warns. In times of war, it grieves. In times of confusion, it mirrors. The final word, then, may be a responsibility. To listen differently, to teach differently, to imagine new ways of telling the old. What if we told the story of Troy beginning with the women? What if the horse were a metaphor for ideology? What if the prophecy were about ecological collapse? What if Aeneas did not escape, but turned back to mourn? To carry Troy forward is not to preserve it, it is to transform it. And in that transformation, we give it breath. Myths survive, not because they are sacred, but because they are elastic. The final word is not to enshrine, but to extend. To let the story continue, even in our contradictions, our discomforts, our doubts. The fire that took Troy was real. The one that keeps it burning now is figurative. It is the fire of interpretation, of inquiry, of voice. So what is the final word? That the city burned? Yes, but not all that burns is gone. That the story hurts, but pain is not the end of telling. That Troy teaches, but only if we listen. That the myth is not closed, because we are still open. This is not an ending, it is an echo. And if we are quiet enough, we will hear it begin again. And even now, as we stand outside the walls of our own present, listening for omens in the wind, we return to Troy for guidance. We invoke it when monuments fall, when voices are silenced, when promises collapse. Troy gives us the vocabulary to name those moments. It gives us a lens, not to escape through myth, but to deepen our understanding of the real. We speak of Trojan moments in politics, of Cassandra warnings in science, of Achilles' heels in character. These terms lifted from ancient soil are used every day because we still need them. We need myth, not as fantasy, but as framework. And frameworks evolve. They adapt. They absorb the light and shadow of the cultures that wield them. The final word is not a punctuation mark. It is an opening through which new words flow. Perhaps Troy's story survives, not in spite of its contradictions, but because of them. Because it holds complexity. Because it allows grief and glory to sit side by side. Because it refuses to resolve what cannot be resolved. The final word is an act of renewal. It is the moment we close the book, only to reopen it. The pause between voices when one storyteller falls silent and another begins. We do not need to agree on what Troy means. We only need to continue asking, to continue listening, to continue speaking. And if we do, then Troy is not lost, not truly, because the story never belonged to stone. It belongs to us, and we are still telling it.